Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity slows its pace, science speaks softly, and big questions are allowed to unfold without urgency. This is a place for winding thoughts rather than racing conclusions, a place where ideas are explored gently enough to let the mind rest while it wanders. Tonight, we're settling into a question that sounds dramatic at first, but becomes strangely quiet the longer you sit with it. Not a question about aliens arriving tomorrow, or secret messages hidden in the stars, but something closer to home, something buried under our feet, folded into stone, dust, and time itself. Before we go any further, take a moment to notice where you are. Maybe you're lying in bed with the lights low. Maybe you're listening through headphones while the world outside grows quieter. Wherever you are, what time is it right now? Not just the number on a clock, but the feeling of the hour. Late evening has a different texture than early morning. The world breathes differently. And wherever you're listening from, that place has its own deep history, far older than the buildings, roads, and names we know today. If you find this kind of slow exploration calming, or if it helps your thoughts loosen their grip after a long day, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this small, quiet corner of the internet continue doing exactly this. Now there's no rush. Nothing here needs to be solved tonight. We're simply following a thread and seeing where it leads. The idea we're circling is simple to say, but difficult to sit with. What if we are not Earth's first civilization? Not the first beings to build, organize, measure, and reshape the world in complex ways? Not the first to leave marks that once meant something to someone. It sounds unsettling at first, perhaps even a little uncomfortable, because it nudges at a story we're used to telling. A story where human history rises in a clean line from stone tools to smartphones, where progress moves forward like an arrow, never looping back, never resetting. But nature rarely works in straight lines. Rivers curve, coastlines erode and rebuild, forests grow, burn, and return. Even life itself has restarted more than once on this planet, after mass extinctions wiped the slate nearly clean. So it's reasonable, at least quietly reasonable, to wonder whether intelligence and organisation might also follow a less tidy path. The version of history most of us learned is practical and efficient. Humans emerge, develop tools, invent agriculture, build cities, create writing, and eventually arrive at the modern world. It's a useful framework. It helps us teach, categorize, and understand broad patterns. But usefulness is not the same as completeness, and completeness is hard to achieve when most of Earth's surface is dynamic, restless, and very good at erasing things. Consider how fragile modern civilization actually is. Glass towers, data centers, highways, satellites. They feel permanent while we live among them, but they rely on constant maintenance. Stop that maintenance for a few decades, and nature begins to reclaim. Stop it for centuries, and structures weaken. Stretch that to thousands of years, and recognizable forms vanish. Steel rusts, concrete cracks, plastics break down under sunlight and pressure. Paper turns to dust. Even stone, given enough time, wears away. Now imagine not just abandonment, but catastrophe layered on top. Rising seas, shifting tectonic plates, volcanic eruptions, ice ages advancing and retreating, asteroid impacts. Earth has experienced all of these, sometimes repeatedly. Entire landscapes have been submerged, crushed, scraped clean, and rebuilt. The planet is not a museum. It is a workshop that never closes. When we picture ancient civilizations, we often imagine ruins rising neatly from the ground, like carefully staged reminders of the past. But that image is selective. We see what survives under specific conditions. Dry climates preserve. Stable ground protects. Dense stone resists time better than wood or earth. Most human settlements, even relatively recent ones, leave little behind. Villages built of timber, mud brick, or packed earth disappear quietly, leaving faint traces that only careful excavation can detect. And excavation itself is limited. We have not dug everywhere. We have not mapped every seabed in detail. We have not drilled into every sediment layer with equal curiosity. Large portions of the planet remain unexplored, especially beneath oceans, ice sheets, dense forests, and modern cities. What we know is impressive, but it is not total. This is where the question begins to feel less like speculation and more like a reasonable pause. If a complex civilization existed tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, what would realistically remain today? Not what we hope would remain, but what geology would allow. Would we expect skyscrapers? Probably not. Would we expect digital records? Almost certainly not. Would we expect language preserved intact? Only if it were carved deeply into durable stone, and even then only fragments. What might remain instead are subtler things, anomalies in stonework, unexpected tool marks, materials in places they seem out of place, patterns that don't quite fit the timeline we've constructed, but are easy to dismiss as errors, coincidences, or misinterpretations. Science, after all, is careful by necessity. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and caution is usually a virtue. Yet caution can sometimes turn into habit. When evidence doesn't fit, the first impulse is often to adjust the interpretation rather than the framework. That's not a flaw unique to archaeology or history. It's human. We all do it. Our brains like continuity. They prefer smooth narratives to messy ones. There's also a quiet assumption woven into modern thinking that technological progress must look like ours, that intelligence inevitably leads to metal, electricity, fossil fuels, and digital computation. But that assumption rests on a single data point. Us. We know how our path unfolded, influenced by specific environments, resources, and pressures. Another civilization, even another human one, might have followed a different route entirely. Different materials, different energy sources, different priorities. A society focused on sustainability rather than expansion might leave far fewer scars. A culture built around organic materials would fade faster. A technological system based on chemistry or biology rather than metallurgy might leave almost nothing recognizable after deep time. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when time itself acts as an eraser. There's also the matter of time scale. Modern civilization, depending on how you define it, is a few thousand years old. Industrial civilization is a few centuries old. The fossil record spans hundreds of millions of years. Homo sapiens have existed for roughly 300,000 years. That's enough time for multiple cycles of rise and collapse, especially if environmental stresses or global events intervened. Ice cores tell us the climate has shifted dramatically, sometimes abruptly. Sea levels have risen and fallen by over 100 meters. Entire coastlines that would have been ideal for early settlements now lie submerged. If you were building a civilization without knowledge of future sea level rise, you'd likely choose rivers, deltas, and coasts, the very places least likely to preserve evidence long term. Think about how much of modern human activity is concentrated near water. Ports, cities, trade routes. Now imagine those regions flooded, buried under sediment, or scoured by currents for thousands of years. Detection becomes difficult not because nothing is there, but because access is limited and interpretation is uncertain. Even on land, the surface we walk on is not the surface our ancestors walked on. Soil builds up, layers accumulate, forests grow and die. Glaciers grind rock into powder and drag it across continents. A structure built 50,000 years ago might now lie tens of meters below ground, compressed into layers we rarely examine unless there's a reason to dig. And reasons are usually practical: construction, mining, infrastructure. Archaeology often happens when something else is already disturbing the ground. Entire regions remain untouched because there's no immediate economic motivation to explore them deeply. curiosity alone rarely funds massive excavation. There's another layer to this question that often goes unspoken. It's not just about whether evidence exists, but whether we would recognise it if it did. Our interpretations are shaped by expectations. We know what a Roman road looks like. We know how medieval tools are shaped. We know how ancient writing systems behave. But something older or different might not trigger recognition. It might look natural, or it might look like a mistake. Stone formations are a good example. Nature produces symmetry, angles, and repetition all on its own. Distinguishing between natural and artificial structures is not always straightforward, especially when erosion has softened edges and broken patterns. Experts debate these things carefully, but debates often stay within established boundaries. Pushing beyond them requires strong justification. It's also worth acknowledging how emotionally charged this idea can become. The suggestion that others may have come before us sometimes gets tangled up with claims that lack evidence, or with narratives that dismiss well-established science entirely. That makes serious discussion harder. Legitimate questions get lost among louder ones. Skepticism becomes defensive rather than curious. But curiosity doesn't require belief. It only requires openness. Asking what if does not mean concluding therefore yes. It means allowing uncertainty to exist without rushing to close it. There's something humbling about the idea that civilization might not be a permanent achievement, but a temporary state. That intelligence, organisation and culture might bloom, fade, and bloom again under the right conditions. It reframes progress not as a straight climb, but as a pattern that depends on stability, memory and continuity. Memory, especially, is fragile. Without writing, knowledge must be passed orally. Oral traditions are powerful, but vulnerable to disruption. A population bottleneck, a long drought, a widespread disaster, and centuries of accumulated understanding can vanish in a few generations. Tools can be reinvented. Skills can be relearned. But continuity is hard to restore once broken. We tend to think of ourselves as standing at the peak of a long ascent, but peaks are often followed by descents. History shows cycles even on short timescales. Empires rise, fragment and dissolve. Languages disappear. Technologies are forgotten and rediscovered. Multiply that pattern across deep time, and the idea of earlier, now invisible civilizations feels less extreme. None of this requires imagining futuristic machines or advanced physics beyond our understanding. A civilization can be complex without being industrial. It can be organized without being global. It can be sophisticated without leaving obvious ruins. Complexity doesn't always announce itself loudly. What matters most is not proving the idea one way or another, but noticing how incomplete our picture necessarily is. Earth is old. Human attention is recent. The gap between those two facts is vast. As we continue, the focus won't be on declaring lost worlds or rewriting textbooks overnight. Instead, we'll move slowly through the kinds of evidence that do exist, the gaps that remain, and the questions scientists quietly argue over when headlines aren't watching. And while all of that unfolds, there's no need to hold the question tightly. You can let it rest in the background, like a thought that doesn't demand resolution. After all, uncertainty doesn't always need to be solved. Sometimes it's enough to notice that it's there, patiently waiting beneath the surface, much like the past itself. Most of us grow up absorbing a version of history that feels neat, reassuring, and surprisingly well behaved. It begins with early humans struggling to survive, moves steadily through discoveries and inventions, and eventually arrives at the modern world as if that outcome were always waiting at the end of the road. Stone tools lead to farming. Farming leads to villages. Villages become cities. Cities give rise to writing, science, industry, and eventually glowing screens in our pockets. It's a story that flows in one direction, rarely looping back, rarely stumbling, and almost never asking us to imagine that something equally complex might have happened long before the earliest chapters we were taught to read. This version of history is comfortable for a reason. It gives us a sense of place. It suggests that we know where we came from and roughly how we got here. It reassures us that progress is natural, that knowledge accumulates, and that civilization, once achieved, is something humanity simply builds upon. There's a quiet promise embedded in that story. The idea that we are the inheritors of everything that came before, standing on the highest rung of a ladder that was always meant to reach this point. It's not that this story is entirely wrong. Much of it is well supported by evidence. We have fossils, tools, settlements, and written records that trace a clear arc across thousands of years. Archaeology, anthropology, and history have done extraordinary work reconstructing the lives of people who lived long before us. The issue isn't fabrication, it's compression. In order to be teachable, history is simplified. In order to be remembered, it's smoothed. Sharp edges are filed down, uncertainties are minimized, and gaps are quietly bridged with phrases like, "it is believed," or "most scholars agree." Those phrases do important work, but they also act as soft pillows around unknowns. They allow us to move forward without lingering too long on what we don't know, and most of the time, that's practical. No one wants to spend their entire life questioning every assumption before breakfast. But when it comes to deep time, to tens or hundreds of thousands of years, that comfort can become a limitation. The standard narrative assumes continuity. Once humans reach a certain level of organization, the story goes that complexity only increases. There may be setbacks, wars, collapses, or dark ages, but the overall trend remains upward. Knowledge might be lost locally, but somewhere else it survives. Writing ensures memory. Technology ensures efficiency. Civilization, in this view, is resilient by default. Yet history on smaller scales tells a different story. Entire societies have vanished. Not just declined or transformed, but disappeared so thoroughly that their languages are lost and their names forgotten. We know they existed only because of scattered ruins or brief mentions by others. Even then, much about them remains unclear. If that can happen over a few thousand years, it's worth asking what might happen over 10 times that span, or more. There's also a tendency to treat history as if it were observed from above, as though humanity moved together in a single line. In reality, development is uneven. Different groups advance in different ways at different times. Some invent agriculture early, others continue as hunter-gatherers for millennia. Some build monumental architecture, others focus on portability and adaptability. The absence of certain technologies does not imply the absence of intelligence or organization. It often reflects different priorities shaped by environment and culture. The comfortable story flattens these differences into a single ladder of progress. Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Industrial Age. Each label implies replacement rather than overlap. But archaeology shows overlap everywhere. Stone tools persist alongside metal ones. Oral traditions coexist with writing. Old methods remain useful long after new ones appear. History is layered, not stepped. This matters because when we imagine earlier civilizations, we often imagine them needing to fit into the same ladder. We ask whether they had metal, cities, writing, or machines. If they didn't, we assume they couldn't have been complex, but complexity isn't a checklist. It's a pattern of relationships. Social organization, knowledge transmission, environmental management, and symbolic systems can exist without leaving behind obvious artifacts that survive deep time. The story we tell ourselves also relies heavily on visibility. What we can see, we trust. What we can't see, we doubt. Written records are treated as more real than oral ones. Stone buildings are treated as more significant than wooden or earthen structures. Permanent settlements are privileged over mobile ones. This creates a bias towards certain kinds of societies and away from others. Imagine a civilization that built primarily with organic materials, wood, fibers, plant-based composites. Imagine it valued adaptability over permanence, choosing structures that could be dismantled and rebuilt rather than monumentalized. Imagine it managed landscapes carefully, leaving little in the way of scars. Such a civilization could be sophisticated, knowledgeable, and long-lasting, yet leave behind almost nothing recognizable after enough time had passed. Now add natural forces to the equation. Floods, fires, earthquakes, glaciation. Even stone does not last forever under these conditions. The idea that civilization must announce itself loudly to be real is a modern assumption shaped by our own habits. There's also a subtle emotional component to the comfortable story. It flatters us. It positions the present as the culmination of everything that came before. We are not just living in history, we are its point. This can make alternative possibilities feel threatening. If others came before us and reached similar heights, it challenges the idea that our moment is uniquely special or guaranteed to continue. That discomfort often shows up as resistance, not always explicit but quiet. Questions get reframed as fringe, anomalies get explained away quickly. Curiosity is tolerated only up to the point where it begins to unsettle the narrative too much. Again, this isn't malicious, it's human. Stories help us orient ourselves. Changing them can feel like losing solid ground. Education reinforces this comfort. Textbooks present timelines with clean lines and confident dates. Uncertainty is minimized, partly because it's harder to teach. A classroom needs structure, exams need answers. There's little room for long discussions about missing evidence or unresolved debates, especially at early levels. By the time students encounter academic uncertainty, many assumptions are already fixed. Even museums, which often do excellent work, tend to present polished interpretations. Displays are curated to tell a coherent story. Labels are concise. Visitors move quickly. There isn't space to linger on doubt. The result is a sense that history is largely settled, with only minor details left to fill in. But behind the scenes, researchers argue constantly. Dates are revised, sites are reinterpreted, new discoveries force re-evaluation. This is how science works. Yet those revisions rarely reach the public imagination with the same force as the original story. First impressions stick. The comfortable story also benefits from a psychological shortcut known as present bias. We assume that the world we know is typical. We project current conditions backward. Because industrial civilization is loud, expansive, and resource-intensive, we imagine that any earlier advanced civilization would have looked similar. When we don't find evidence of highways, factories, or large-scale mining in deep antiquity, we conclude that nothing comparable existed. But similarity is not a requirement. Different starting conditions produce different outcomes. A civilization developing in a resource-rich but fragile environment might avoid extraction-heavy methods. One shaped by repeated natural disasters might prioritize redundancy and decentralization. One arising in isolation might evolve along paths we wouldn't immediately recognize as technological. Another assumption embedded in the story is permanence of success. We tend to believe that once a society reaches a certain threshold, it becomes harder to erase. Yet modern examples challenge this. Cities abandoned for political or environmental reasons can decay rapidly. Infrastructure fails quickly without maintenance. Knowledge stored digitally is surprisingly fragile. Servers require power. Formats become obsolete. Without active preservation, modern records could vanish faster than stone inscriptions. Scale matters too. Our civilization feels global, but that's a recent development. For most of human history, even large empires occupied limited regions. A civilization spread thinly across continents would be more resilient in some ways, but also harder to detect later. Its footprint would be diffuse, not concentrated. The comfortable story rarely addresses how much has already been lost. We focus on what survives, not on what didn't. We marvel at the libraries that existed but forget how many burned. We celebrate texts that were copied, but rarely count those that weren't. survival is often accidental. What remains is not necessarily representative. This selective survival shapes our expectations. We assume that if something important existed, it would have survived. But importance doesn't guarantee durability. Sometimes the most significant ideas are carried in minds, not carved in stone. When those minds disappear, so do the ideas. There's also a tendency to equate age with primitiveness. Older automatically means simpler in the popular imagination. This isn't supported by evidence. Early humans demonstrated remarkable skill, planning, and creativity. Complex behaviours appear far earlier than once believed. Each new discovery pushes dates back further. Symbolic art, long-distance trade, and sophisticated tool use keep appearing deeper in the past. Every time this happens, the story stretches. The ladder gets longer, but the underlying structure remains the same. Progress still flows upward. We rarely ask whether the ladder itself is the right metaphor. Cycles are less comforting than ladders. They imply repetition. They suggest that achievements can be temporary. They raise uncomfortable questions about our own future. If others rose and fell, why wouldn't we? If knowledge can be lost, how secure is ours? There's also a social dimension. Acknowledging uncertainty can be misinterpreted as undermining science, even when it's the opposite. Science advances by questioning, but public discourse often prefers confidence. Nuance doesn't spread as easily as certainty, so comfortable stories persist, not because they are enforced, but because they are efficient. It's worth noting that challenging the story does not require rejecting mainstream science. It requires expanding the frame, allowing for the possibility that the record is incomplete, accepting that absence of evidence, especially across vast timescales, does not close the case. The story we tell ourselves about history is not a lie. It's a sketch, useful, informative, but unfinished. And like any sketch, it leaves out details that don't fit easily within the outline. We won't be tearing that sketch apart. We'll be gently shading in the margins, looking at places where the lines blur. Not to replace certainty with fantasy, but to make room for the idea that Earth's past may be more layered than we've been taught to expect. There's no need to resolve that idea tonight. It can sit quietly, like an unanswered question left on the table, the kind that doesn't demand immediate action, only patience. Because once you notice how comfortable the story is, it becomes easier to notice where it might also be incomplete. And noticing, without rushing, is often where understanding begins. Sometimes the first hint that the story might be incomplete doesn't come from texts, myths, or bold theories, but from the ground itself, from layers of soil, from stone that looks slightly out of place, from patterns that seem to resist easy explanation. Not dramatic revelations, not sudden proof, just a quiet sense that something doesn't line up as neatly as expected. Archaeologists, geologists, and surveyors encounter this feeling more often than a headline suggests. It usually begins as a small pause, a moment where someone looks twice at a formation and thinks, something about this deserves more time. The Earth, after all, is not just a passive stage where history happens, it is an active participant. It moves, folds, erodes, buries, compresses and reshapes everything placed upon it. Over long stretches of time, it becomes a kind of memory system, though not one designed for easy reading. Instead of neat pages, it stores information in layers, fractures, mineral changes, and subtle alignments. Reading that memory requires patience and humility, because the Earth does not preserve things for our convenience. When people imagine ancient remains, they often picture ruins rising visibly from the surface. Columns, walls, recognizable outlines. But that expectation comes from a narrow slice of history, mostly recent, mostly built in durable stone, mostly preserved by accident. The deeper you go into time, the less likely that kind of preservation becomes. Instead, what survives are traces, anomalies, things that don't shout but quietly persist. One of the most basic ways the ground remembers is through stratification. Layers of sediment accumulate over time, each one a snapshot of environmental conditions. Floods leave behind silt. Volcanic eruptions deposit ash. Winds carry fine particles that settle slowly. Over thousands of years, these layers build up, compress, and harden. Archaeological material caught between them becomes sealed in place but also distorted. Structures collapse under their own weight. Organic materials decay. Only certain substances endure. When excavations cut through these layers, researchers expect to see a general order. Older layers below, newer layers above. That principle holds most of the time, but not always cleanly. Earthquakes, landslides, burrowing animals, root systems and human activity can mix layers. This complicates interpretation. Something found deeper than expected may be dismissed as having shifted downward. Sometimes that explanation is correct, sometimes it's a convenient assumption. There are sites where objects appear in layers far older than their accepted age. Stone tools beneath deposits thought to predate humans. Worked stones in contexts that challenge established timelines. These findings are controversial, often debated intensely, and frequently set aside as errors or misinterpretations. Again, caution is appropriate. But when patterns repeat across different locations, the question quietly returns. Are all of these mistakes? Or are we missing something larger? The ground also remembers through geometry. Nature produces many shapes, but it also produces randomness. When stones align in consistent patterns, especially across large areas, it raises questions. Straight lines, right angles, repeated spacing. None of these are impossible naturally, but they are statistically less common. Distinguishing between natural formations and intentional construction is one of the most difficult tasks in archaeology, especially when erosion has softened edges and blurred intent. There are places where stone blocks lie fitted together with precision that seems excessive if their only purpose were functional. Surfaces smoothed beyond what weathering alone would produce. Joints so tight that even thin blades cannot be inserted between stones. In many cases, these sites are attributed to known ancient cultures, though the techniques used sometimes exceed what those cultures are thought to have possessed at the time. Explanations are proposed. Lost methods, skilled labour, simpler tools used more effectively than we imagine. These may be correct, but they also reveal how much uncertainty remains. Then there are formations that are dismissed outright as natural, yet continue to trouble observers. Not because they look impressive, but because they look intentional in subtle ways. Terraces that follow unnatural gradients. Platforms buried under sediment. Symmetry where chaos would be expected. These are not proof of anything on their own, but they contribute to a sense that the Earth's surface may be holding on to stories we haven't fully learned how to read. The oceans complicate this further. Sea levels have risen and fallen dramatically over the last 100,000 years. During the last ice age, vast areas of today's continental shelves were exposed land. Rivers flowed where there is now open sea. Coastlines extended far beyond their current positions. These would have been prime locations for human settlement. Flat, fertile, rich in resources, and now almost entirely underwater. Underwater archaeology is difficult, expensive, and still relatively young as a field. Large areas remain unmapped in detail. Sonar surveys reveal shapes and anomalies, but interpretation is slow and cautious. Some features turn out to be natural, others remain ambiguous. A submerged formation might be dismissed as a geological coincidence until further evidence is found. But further evidence requires funding, time and interest, all of which are limited. The ground remembers disasters especially well, though not always in ways that are easy to decode. Massive floods can scour landscapes, ripping away topsoil and redepositing it elsewhere. Tsunamis leave behind chaotic layers of debris far inland. Volcanic eruptions bury entire regions under ash and lava. These events can erase surface evidence almost completely. Settlements vanish, not gradually but abruptly. Imagine a coastal civilization struck by a sudden sea level rise, combined with tectonic activity. Structures collapse, debris washes away. Survivors migrate inland, abandoning old sites. Over generations, the memory of exact locations fades. Meanwhile, sediment accumulates. Sealing remains beneath layers that will not be disturbed for tens of thousands of years. From above, the land looks empty, but the memory remains, locked away. Ice is another powerful eraser. Glaciers advance slowly but relentlessly, grinding rock, flattening landscapes, dragging material across continents. Anything in their path is crushed or buried. When they retreat, they leave behind moraines, sediments, and altered terrain. If a civilization existed in regions later covered by ice, physical evidence would be sparse at best. Only the deepest or hardest materials might survive, scattered and displaced. The Earth also remembers through chemical signatures. Changes in soil composition can hint at past human activity. Elevated levels of certain elements. Unusual concentrations of charcoal indicating widespread burning. Traces of agriculture altering local ecosystems. These signals are subtle and require careful analysis. They don't announce cities or names, but they suggest patterns of behaviour. In some regions, soil layers show signs of intense modification long before known civilizations, altered landscapes that suggest large-scale human intervention, forests managed rather than wild, land shaped deliberately. Again, these are often attributed to early agricultural practices, which may be accurate. But the scale sometimes surprises researchers. It suggests organised activity over long periods. Another way the ground remembers is through absence. Missing layers, gaps in deposition that indicate erosion or disturbance. These gaps can hide entire chapters. If a period of settlement coincides with erosion rather than deposition, evidence may be removed rather than preserved. Later layers then settle atop an erased surface. From a stratigraphic perspective, it's as if nothing happened there at all. This creates a bias towards periods of burial. Times when sediment was accumulating preserve history better than times when it was being stripped away. If a civilization flourished during a period of erosion, its footprint might be minimal in the geological record. Our timelines then become skewed toward what was preserved, not necessarily what was most significant. The ground also interacts with human expectations. Excavation strategies are guided by hypotheses. Researchers look where they expect to find things. They dig at depths suggested by established timelines. When nothing appears, the absence reinforces the expectation. Areas outside those expectations remain unexplored. This isn't negligence, it's efficiency. But it means that surprising discoveries often come from unexpected places. Construction sites, quarries, road cuts. Accidental exposures reveal layers that weren't being actively studied. Sometimes these finds challenge assumptions. Sometimes they're quickly reinterpreted to fit existing models. There's also the issue of scale. A civilization doesn't need to be global to be significant. A regional culture could rise, thrive, and fall without ever covering vast territory. Its footprint might be subtle, its materials recycled by later groups, its sites built over or repurposed. The ground would remember, but in fragments. Stone, often assumed to be permanent, is not immune to time. Limestone dissolves, granite fractures, sandstone erodes. Even the hardest materials eventually break down under weathering, temperature changes, and biological activity. Over tens of thousands of years, edges soften, tool marks blur, intent becomes harder to discern. Biology plays a role too. Roots penetrate structures, microorganisms break down minerals, animals burrow. Life is constantly rearranging the surface. This living activity further complicates preservation. The ground is not static, it is busy. When anomalies appear, they are often isolated. A single object, a single formation. Alone, they are easy to dismiss. But patterns emerge when similar anomalies appear in different places, separated by distance but linked by characteristics. That's when questions gain weight. Still, science moves carefully. Extraordinary claims require more than suggestion. They require reproducibility, context, and overwhelming evidence, and rightly so. The history of archaeology includes mistakes, misinterpretations, and even deliberate fraud. Skepticism protects against that, but skepticism should not become blindness. The ground does not lie, but it does speak quietly. It requires patience, and sometimes a willingness to admit that our current frameworks may not capture everything it's trying to say. There's a subtle difference between saying this cannot be and saying we do not yet understand this. One closes the door, the other leaves it slightly open. Much of what the ground seems to remember falls into that second category. Not proven, not dismissed, but waiting. As techniques improve, new methods allow us to read deeper. Ground-penetrating radar, LIDAR revealing hidden structures beneath forests, chemical analysis uncovering traces invisible to the naked eye. Each advancement peels back another layer, and with each layer the past grows more complex, not simpler. It's also important to remember that the Earth does not prioritise human history. It records everything indiscriminately. Asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions, climate shifts. Human activity is just one thread among many. Sometimes it's preserved, sometimes it's overwritten, sometimes it's scattered beyond recognition. The idea that the ground might remember something else doesn't require belief in lost golden ages or advanced ancient technologies. It only requires acceptance that the past is vast, that preservation is uneven, and that our knowledge is incomplete. Those are uncontroversial statements. The discomfort arises from following them to their logical conclusions. If much has been erased, if much remains buried or submerged, then our picture of human history, especially its earliest chapters, is necessarily partial. That doesn't diminish what we know, it contextualizes it. As this thought settles, there's no need to rush towards certainty. The ground has waited a very long time. It isn't in a hurry. When people hear the phrase lost city, they often imagine something romantic and distant. Stone temples swallowed by jungle vines, sand-drowned ruins revealed by shifting dunes. These images feel familiar, almost expected, because they fit neatly into the version of history we're comfortable with. Civilizations rise, fall, and sometimes leave ruins that wait patiently to be rediscovered. There's nothing particularly unsettling about that. It confirms what we already believe, that complex societies existed where we thought they did and vanished roughly when we expected them to. But there's another category of lost places that doesn't sit as easily. Not cities forgotten because time passed and vegetation grew, but sites that appear in places, layers, or contexts where cities were not supposed to exist at all. Places that don't politely wait their turn in the timeline. They show up too early, too deep, or too far outside the accepted map of ancient civilization, and when they do, the reaction is rarely excitement at first, it's hesitation. Part of that hesitation comes from how the word city is defined. In modern thinking, a city implies dense population, permanent architecture, administrative organisation, and often monumental construction. Writing, or at least record keeping, is usually assumed. When archaeologists look for cities, they look for these markers: streets, foundations, public buildings, waste systems. If those aren't present in recognisable form, the label is withheld. Yet this definition is shaped by recent history. Cities like Rome, Athens, or Uruk set a template that we subconsciously project backward. We assume earlier urban life must resemble these examples in miniature, but urbanism itself may not have a single blueprint. Different environments encourage different solutions. A city built around stone will leave a different trace than one built around wood, earth, or organic materials. A city that spreads horizontally will vanish differently than one that stacks vertically. Some of the most unsettling discoveries are not towering ruins, but large organised settlements revealed only through subtle clues. Soil discolorations, post holes arranged in patterns, vast networks of earthworks barely visible from the ground. These don't look impressive at first glance. In fact, they often look like nothing at all until technology reveals them from above. One of the clearest examples of this came not from excavation, but from the air. When LIDAR scanning began to be used over dense forests, especially in places like Central America, it transformed what archaeologists could see. Under thick jungle canopy, LIDAR revealed extensive urban networks, roads, terraces, plazas, and residential zones stretching far beyond what was previously believed. Not isolated ceremonial centres, but interconnected systems supporting large populations. What was surprising wasn't just their scale, but their age. Some of these settlements were far older and far more complex than expected for their time period. The prevailing image of scattered villages gave way to something more organised. The cities had been there all along, simply hidden by vegetation and time. But forests are only one hiding place. Another is water. Coastlines are especially deceptive because they move. During the last ice age, sea levels were dramatically lower. Entire regions that are now submerged were once dry land. These areas would have been attractive places to settle, offering access to marine resources, rivers, and trade routes. Underwater surveys have begun to reveal structures that raise questions. Stone formations arranged in ways that don't look entirely natural. Walls, steps, platforms. Some are dismissed as geological oddities, others remain debated. The challenge is that underwater archaeology is slow and cautious. Visibility is limited, dating is difficult, context is easily disturbed. Still, the sheer amount of land now underwater suggests that our picture of the early settlement is incomplete. If large populations lived along ancient coastlines, their cities would now lie beneath the sea, out of sight and out of mind. Their absence from the record would not mean they never existed, only that we're looking in the wrong place. There are also cases on land where cities appear far earlier than expected. Large settlements with organised layouts that predate the invention of writing, metal tools, or even agriculture as traditionally defined. These sites don't fit comfortably into established categories. They force archaeologists to ask whether complexity emerged in different ways than previously assumed. One example often discussed is the presence of large ceremonial or communal sites built by societies thought to be primarily nomadic. The assumption has long been that permanent architecture follows agriculture, that people must settle before they build. Yet some sites challenge this order. They suggest that large groups of people came together regularly, organised labour, planned construction, and invested in shared spaces long before they farmed extensively. This doesn't just tweak the timeline, it rearranges it. It suggests that social complexity may come first and economic systems later. That belief, coordination, and shared identity can motivate monumental effort even without permanent settlement. A city, in this sense, becomes less about walls and more about networks of people. In other parts of the world, traces of extensive urban planning have been found beneath modern cities. Layers of construction built atop one another over thousands of years. This isn't surprising in itself, but sometimes the earliest layers show a level of organisation that seems out of place. Wide streets, drainage systems, standardised building layouts. These features imply planning and governance at a time when such systems are thought to be rare. When these findings emerge, they are usually absorbed into the existing framework by adjusting dates slightly, or redefining what counts as advanced. That's not wrong, but it can obscure the larger pattern. The pattern being that organised human settlements appear again and again, earlier and more often than expected, only to disappear from view when conditions change. Disappearance doesn't always mean collapse in the dramatic sense. Sometimes cities fade because trade routes shift. Rivers change course. Climate patterns alter rainfall. People leave gradually, taking materials with them, reusing stone, wood, and metal elsewhere. Over time, what remains is not a ruin, but a subtle imprint. There's also the problem of scale bias. Archaeology often focuses on prominent sites, capital cities, ceremonial centres, elite structures. But most people don't live in palaces. They live in ordinary dwellings that leave less durable traces. A civilization could support millions across a region, while leaving only a handful of monumental sites. If those sites are destroyed or buried, the civilization becomes archaeologically faint. In some regions, earthworks provide a different kind of clue. Massive mounds, embankments, and geometric shapes built into the landscape. Some are clearly ceremonial, others appear practical, used for water management or agriculture. Their size suggests coordinated labour over long periods. In some cases, these earthworks are so eroded that their scale was underestimated for decades. Only when aerial surveys revealed their full extent did their significance become clear. Entire landscapes reshaped intentionally, not casually but systematically. These were not small, scattered efforts. They point to populations large enough and organised enough to alter their environment on a massive scale. What makes these discoveries uncomfortable is not that they exist, but that they were overlooked for so long. They didn't fit the expected picture, so they remained invisible. Not literally, but conceptually. Once seen, they forced a rethinking of what ancient societies were capable of. There are also urban sites in regions once thought marginal. Dense forests, floodplains, highlands, places assumed to be unsuitable for large populations. When evidence of cities appears there, it challenges environmental assumptions as well as historical ones. It suggests that ancient people adapted in ways we hadn't considered, managing resources more effectively than we imagined. This raises an interesting possibility. If our assumptions about where cities should be have limited our search, then there may be many more sites waiting in places we haven't seriously examined. Deserts that were once greener, plains now covered by farmland, areas beneath modern infrastructure. Modern cities themselves are a barrier. Building atop earlier settlements destroys or obscures what came before. Excavations in urban centres are rare and limited. When they do happen, they often reveal layers of occupation deeper than expected. Each layer tells a story, but also hints at others below. Dating remains a persistent challenge. Radiocarbon dating relies on organic material, which doesn't always survive. Stone structures can be difficult to date directly. Context matters, but context can be disturbed. As a result, some sites float in time, loosely anchored by estimates rather than precise dates. This uncertainty leaves room for debate. Critics argue that claims of unexpectedly early cities rely on weak dating or misinterpretation. Supporters argue that conservative estimates underestimate human capability. Both sides bring evidence. The truth likely lies somewhere between certainty and dismissal. What's clear is that the discovery of cities where none were expected keeps happening. Each time the timeline stretches a little. Each time the story becomes less linear. Instead of a single birthplace of civilization spreading outward, we see multiple centres emerging independently. Different experiments in living together, organising space and shaping the land. This multiplicity matters. It suggests that civilization is not a rare accident, but a recurring pattern under the right conditions. When populations reach a certain density, when resources allow, when social bonds strengthen, complex settlements emerge. They may not all look the same, and they may not all last, but they appear again and again. If that's true, then it's reasonable to ask whether some of these experiments occurred earlier than we currently recognise. Not necessarily global empires, but regional centres of organisation that rose and fell without leaving obvious monuments. The phrase, "weren't supposed to be there," reveals more about expectations than evidence. It points to the boundaries we've drawn around possibility. When discoveries cross those boundaries, they feel disruptive. But disruption is often how understanding advances. It's also worth noticing how quickly yesterday's impossibility becomes today's accepted fact. A century ago, the idea that complex societies existed deep in the Amazon would have been dismissed. Now it's mainstream. What else might follow the same path? None of this requires imagining lost utopias or advanced technologies beyond plausibility. It only requires accepting that human societies are more adaptable, more inventive, and more ancient than we once believed. Cities in some form may have risen wherever conditions allowed, long before they entered our textbooks. If cities have been hiding in plain sight, beneath forests, fields, water, and modern streets, then the past is not as empty as it sometimes appears. Stone has a way of making claims feel permanent. Unlike wood or fibre, unlike skin or soil, stone carries a quiet authority. When we see something shaped from it, fitted precisely or arranged deliberately, it feels heavier than explanation. Stone does not bend easily to time, and when it does, it leaves traces of what it once was. That's why stonework plays such a powerful role in how we imagine the past. It feels reliable, solid, trustworthy. And because of that, stone is often where the most uncomfortable questions begin. There is an expectation, usually unspoken, about what kinds of stonework should exist at certain points in history. Rough stones early on, simple stacking, gradual improvement, then much later refinement, precision, monumentality. This expectation is not arbitrary. It's based on what we know about tools, materials and energy sources. Cutting, shaping, transporting and fitting stone requires effort. It requires planning. It requires knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The more precise the stonework, the more infrastructure seems implied behind it. And yet, scattered across the world, there are examples of stone construction that seem to arrive out of order. Stone that appears too precise, too massive or too technically demanding for the time period it's assigned to. These structures don't announce themselves loudly as impossibilities. They simply sit there, quietly resisting easy explanation. One of the first things people notice about such stonework is fit. In some ancient sites, stones weighing many tons are fitted together so tightly that gaps are nearly non-existent. Not just on visible faces, but on internal joints. The surfaces meet cleanly, sometimes with complex angles rather than simple flat planes. This kind of precision is difficult even with modern machinery, yet it appears in contexts where metal tools were limited or supposedly non-existent. The usual response is to underestimate ancient capability. And to be fair, ancient people were far more skilled than we often give them credit for. Stone tools can be remarkably effective. Time, patience and experience can substitute for power in surprising ways. But acknowledging that doesn't fully resolve the question. Skill explains part of it. Scale explains another. Precision at this level, repeated across entire structures, implies systems, not just talent. Transport raises another issue. Many of these stones were moved over long distances, sometimes across uneven terrain, sometimes uphill. The logistics involved are staggering. It's not just a matter of strength, it's coordination, planning routes, preparing foundations, managing labour over extended periods. Even if the methods are theoretically possible, they suggest a level of organisation that doesn't always align with what we think existed at the time. There's also the matter of uniformity. In some sites, stones are shaped to consistent standards, as if produced according to a shared template. That implies measurement, not just rough estimation, but repeatable units. Measurement systems don't require writing, but they do require shared conventions and training. They require continuity. Someone has to teach someone else not just how, but why. In many cases, the stonework in question is attributed to later cultures who reused earlier foundations. This is often a reasonable explanation. Reuse is common. Building atop existing structures saves effort. But in some sites, the deeper layers show higher precision than the upper ones. The oldest stone is the most finely worked. Later additions are rougher, smaller and less exact. This reversal is uncomfortable because it contradicts the idea of gradual improvement. It suggests that knowledge may have declined rather than advanced in those contexts. Again, this is not impossible. Civilizations do lose skills. Techniques can be forgotten. But when this pattern appears repeatedly, across different regions, it invites broader questions. Another striking feature of some ancient stonework is the choice of stone itself. Extremely hard rock, such as granite or diorite, appears in contexts where softer stone would have been far easier to work. Shaping hard stone without metal tools is not impossible, but it is labour-intensive to an extreme degree. Choosing it deliberately suggests either necessity or preference. Necessity might explain some cases. Preference suggests confidence and capability. Surface finishing adds another layer. Some ancient stones are polished to a degree that suggests careful abrasion over long periods. Flatness across large surfaces implies control. Straight edges, smooth curves, and symmetrical forms are not accidents, they are results. Then there are the drill marks. In certain ancient stones, circular holes appear with consistent diameters and depths. The walls of these holes show spiral striations, suggesting rotational drilling. The question is not whether drilling was possible, but how it was achieved so consistently. What kind of drill, powered how, using what abrasives, applied with what force, over what time frame? Proposed explanations exist: bow drills, tubular drills with sand, long hours of work. All of these are plausible in isolation, but when multiple such features appear across a site, the cumulative implication grows. The methods must have been well known, not experimental. They must have been taught, standardized, and relied upon. Stone joints present another puzzle. Some ancient walls feature interlocking stones shaped with complex curves rather than straight lines. These joints increase stability, especially in earthquake-prone regions. Designing and executing them requires understanding stress, movement, and load distribution. Whether or not that understanding was theoretical or empirical, it was real. Earthquake resistance itself is a recurring theme. Some ancient stone structures survive seismic activity that damages or destroys newer buildings nearby. This suggests intentional design choices, flexible joints, sloped walls, carefully balanced masses. These are not random outcomes, they reflect accumulated experience. When these features are discussed, the conversation often drifts toward extremes. Either ancient people were impossibly advanced, or modern scholars are unfairly dismissive. Neither framing is particularly helpful. The more productive space lies in between, acknowledging that our models of technological development may be incomplete, without assuming lost super technologies. Stone also carries symbolic weight. Choosing to build in stone is a statement. It says permanence matters. It says memory matters. Stone structures are not quick solutions. They are investments across generations. That kind of thinking implies long-term stability, or at least the hope of it. What complicates this further is when stonework appears in places where long-term stability seems unlikely. Regions prone to flooding, areas with harsh climates, places where later history shows repeated disruption. Building monumental stone structures there suggests confidence in continuity, or perhaps inheritance from an earlier period of stability. Another uncomfortable detail is precision without ornamentation. Some ancient stonework is remarkably precise but visually plain. No decoration, no inscriptions, just mass and fit. This challenges the assumption that advanced construction must also be expressive. It suggests functionality prioritized over display, or perhaps symbolism we no longer recognize. Dating these structures is notoriously difficult. Stone itself cannot be radiocarbon dated. Organic material associated with construction is often absent or disturbed. As a result, dates are inferred from context, from surrounding layers, from later usage. This leaves room for debate. Earlier dates are often resisted not because they are disproven, but because they disrupt the broader timeline. It's important to be clear here. Most archaeologists do not deny the existence of impressive ancient stonework. The debate centres on interpretation, not observation. How advanced were the societies that built these structures? How early did certain techniques emerge? How widespread were they? And how much might have been lost between then and now? The idea that stone shouldn't have been possible yet reflects our expectations more than the stone's reality. The stone exists. The question is how we reconcile it with our models. Do we stretch the models, or do we compress the evidence? There's also the issue of specialisation. Complex stonework suggests specialised labour. Not everyone in a society needs to know how to cut stone, but someone must. That implies division of labour, training, possibly full-time craftsmen supported by others. This is often associated with agricultural surplus and hierarchical organisation. But again, these associations are based on known examples, not universal rules. It's conceivable that specialisation existed in forms we don't fully recognise. Seasonal labour, ritual construction, cooperative projects spanning generations. These models leave fewer durable traces than permanent workshops or written records. Another factor is continuity. Stone techniques don't appear fully formed overnight. They develop through experimentation. But experimentation leaves mistakes, rough attempts, learning curves. In some sites, those early stages are missing. The stonework appears confident from the start. That could mean earlier experiments happened elsewhere, or earlier layers were destroyed, or we haven't found them yet. Absence of evidence becomes a recurring theme, not as an excuse, but as a reality of deep time. Stone survives better than most materials, but even stone does not survive everything, and context matters as much as the object itself. The emotional reaction to these stones is telling. People stand before them and feel a sense of mismatch. Not awe alone, but dissonance. A quiet question forming beneath the surface. How did they do this? Not in a dismissive way, but in a genuinely curious one. Science thrives on such questions when they're allowed to remain questions. The danger lies in rushing to answers, especially dramatic ones. But there's also danger in refusing to let the question exist at all. What these stones really challenge is the assumption that human capability grows in a single, upward direction. They hint at peaks and valleys, at knowledge gained and lost, at skills refined and then forgotten, not globally, not uniformly, but locally, regionally, unevenly. Stone remembers effort. Every cut, every polish, every joint represents time spent by someone who is no longer here. Whoever they were, they worked within a system that supported that effort. They had reasons, goals, constraints. They were not anomalies. They were participants in a culture. Maps are quiet objects. They don't announce themselves the way monuments do. They don't demand awe through scale or weight. Instead, they sit flat and unassuming. Lines on surfaces, symbols agreed upon by convention. And yet maps can be unsettling in a very particular way. Because unlike stone, which records effort, maps record knowledge. They reveal what someone thought the world looked like, what mattered enough to measure, and what could be imagined even if it could not be seen directly. For most of history, maps were not meant to be perfectly accurate. They were practical tools. They showed coastlines, rivers, trade routes, landmarks. Distances were approximate, directions were relative. Unknown areas were left blank or filled with decoration. Accuracy improved gradually as instruments improved. That's the comfortable story, and much of it is true. But there are maps that don't sit comfortably within that progression. Maps that seem to contain information their creators should not have had. Not just guesswork or symbolic flourishes, but specific geographic features rendered with surprising precision. Coastlines that match real ones more closely than expected. Land masses shown where they were not supposed to be known. details that only make sense when viewed from perspectives unavailable at the time. The discomfort doesn't come from one map alone. Any single example can be explained away, copied from another source, accidentally accurate, later altered, misinterpreted by modern eyes. The discomfort comes from patterns, from multiple maps created in different places and times sharing similar anomalies. One of the first things to understand is that many ancient and medieval maps were compilations. Mapmakers often worked from earlier sources. They copied, combined, corrected, and sometimes embellished what they inherited. This makes tracing origins difficult. A map dated to a particular century may contain information far older than the parchment it's drawn on. The physical object is new. The knowledge it preserves may not be. This matters because when a map shows something unexpected, the question is not just who drew it, but where the information came from. A medieval cartographer might never have seen a distant coastline, but could still reproduce it faithfully if the source material existed. Coastlines are especially revealing. Unlike mountains or forests, coastlines have distinctive shapes. Bays, peninsulas, islands. These shapes are hard to invent convincingly. Random guessing rarely produces accurate outlines. When a map shows a coastline that aligns closely with modern surveys, especially over long distances, it raises eyebrows. The usual explanation is that such accuracy must be coincidence or retrofitting. That modern viewers project accuracy onto vague shapes. Sometimes that's fair. Humans are good at seeing patterns where none exist. But in some cases, the match goes beyond rough resemblance. Angles, proportions, relative positions align in ways that are difficult to dismiss casually. There are maps that depict regions only explored in detail centuries later, not just hinted at, but drawn with specificity. River systems shown correctly. Coastlines placed at roughly correct latitudes. In some cases, inland features appear that would require extensive surveying to know. Latitude is one thing. It can be estimated reasonably well using the sun or stars. Longitude, however, was notoriously difficult to measure accurately before precise timekeeping instruments existed. And yet, some old maps show longitudinal relationships that are surprisingly close to reality. Not perfect, but closer than expected for their time. Another curious feature is the depiction of land masses that were later confirmed, but unknown at the time the map was supposedly created. Sometimes these are dismissed as imaginary continents, which were common. But when those imaginary shapes later turn out to resemble real places, the coincidence becomes harder to ignore. Antarctica is often mentioned in this context, not because its appearance on old maps proves anything dramatic, but because it illustrates the puzzle well. Some maps appear to show a southern landmass with coastlines that roughly match parts of Antarctica, sometimes even suggesting ice-free contours. The standard explanation is that cartographers speculated about a southern continent to balance the northern landmasses, a theoretical idea rather than an observation. That explanation accounts for the concept, but not always for the detail. Why include specific bays or peninsulas? Why place it at particular proportions relative to other continents? Again, coincidence is possible, but repeated coincidence invites curiosity. There are also maps that seem to imply aerial perspectives, river systems branching in ways best seen from above, interior features aligned across vast distances. This doesn't mean the map makers had aircraft. It means the information encoded resembles what we now associate with bird's-eye views. Surveying from the ground can produce accurate results over time, but it requires extensive organisation, long-distance triangulation, measurement standards, consistent methods. When maps show this level of integration across large regions, it implies sustained effort, not casual travel. One response is to attribute this to lost medieval or ancient surveying techniques. That's a reasonable suggestion. Human ingenuity has always exceeded our assumptions. But it leads to another question. If such techniques existed, why do we know so little about them? Why do they leave so few traces outside the maps themselves? Another feature worth noticing is orientation. Many ancient maps are not oriented north. Some place east at the top, others south. This reflects cultural priorities rather than ignorance. What matters is not the orientation, but consistency. When features align correctly relative to one another regardless of orientation, it suggests intentional accuracy. Scale is another clue. Many early maps distort scale dramatically. Important places are enlarged, unimportant ones shrink. But some maps maintain consistent scaling across wide areas. This suggests a different goal, not symbolic representation, but spatial accuracy. There's also the question of what is included and what is left out. Some maps show coastlines in detail but leave interiors blank. Others show river networks deep inland but sketch coasts loosely. This suggests different source materials being combined. Coastal data from sailors, inland data from travellers or traders. The composite nature of these maps hints at information networks. Information networks imply communication, knowledge sharing across regions. Someone had to collect, preserve and transmit this data. That process doesn't require advanced technology, but it does require stability and value placed on knowledge. Knowledge must survive long enough to be copied. This is where the uncomfortable connection to earlier discussion appears. If maps preserve knowledge older than their physical form, then the loss of civilizations doesn't necessarily erase everything. Some information can trickle forward, copied imperfectly, stripped of context but still recognizable. Maps can act like fossils of understanding. Even when the culture that produced the original data is gone, the data itself may persist in altered form. Names change, meanings shift, accuracy degrades, but traces remain. Another subtle point is the presence of errors. Old maps often contain obvious mistakes, coastlines warped, islands misplaced. These errors are sometimes used to argue against accuracy, but errors can coexist with accuracy. A map can be remarkably precise in one area and wildly wrong in another. That doesn't invalidate the precise part, it reflects the uneven availability of information. What's particularly intriguing is when multiple maps share the same error. That suggests a common source. And when they share the same accuracy, that suggests the same thing. Tracing these lineages is difficult, but patterns emerge. The emotional response to these maps often oscillates between fascination and dismissal. Fascination because they hint at deeper knowledge. Dismissal because the implications feel uncomfortable. Accepting that ancient or unknown sources may have possessed sophisticated geographic understanding complicates the timeline. Again, this doesn't require imagining impossible technology. Surveying can be done with simple tools given enough time and organisation. Knowledge can accumulate gradually. But the implication remains that some societies may have been more globally aware than we assume. Another factor is intention. Why map the world at all? Maps are not survival tools in the same way food storage or shelter is. They serve planning, trade, navigation, administration. They imply horizons beyond immediate surroundings. A society that invests in mapping invests in abstraction. Abstract thinking leaves fewer physical traces than stone. It exists in minds, practices and records. When records are lost, abstraction disappears quietly, but occasionally something survives. A copied map, a fragment, a reference. There's also the issue of projection. Modern viewers often project modern mapping standards onto ancient works. That can distort interpretation. But careful analysis accounts for projection differences and still finds anomalies. Scholars debate these issues intensely. Some argue that perceived accuracy is overstated. Others argue it's understated. What's important is that the debate exists, that questions remain open. Maps are particularly challenging because they sit at the intersection of art, science and culture. They are not purely technical documents. They reflect worldview as much as geography. This makes them slippery evidence, hard to pin down, but hard to ignore. When a map shows too much knowledge, the immediate instinct is to explain it away, and often explanations exist. But explanation does not always equal resolution. Sometimes it simply pushes the question back a step. If the knowledge came from earlier sources, where did those sources come from? If those sources were based on observation, who made those observations? If those observers existed, what else did they know? This line of questioning doesn't lead to a single answer. It opens a landscape of possibilities, some mundane, some intriguing, all incomplete. It's also worth remembering how much mapping knowledge was lost even in recorded history. Libraries burned, charts discarded, skills forgotten, navigation knowledge that once guided fleets vanished when trade routes collapsed. If that can happen in a few centuries, imagine what can happen over tens of thousands of years. The Earth itself changes too. Coastlines shift, rivers change course. What was once accurate becomes outdated. A map drawn carefully in one era becomes misleading in another. This complicates interpretation. A map that looks wrong today may have been right once. Sea level rise is especially relevant. A coastline drawn during a low sea level period would not match the modern coast, but might match submerged features. That possibility is rarely considered outside specialised fields. None of this proves that ancient map makers possessed forbidden knowledge or that lost civilizations surveyed the globe. Proof requires stronger evidence, but the maps themselves remain as questions on paper. Quiet ones, patient ones. They remind us that knowledge does not always advance cleanly. It can fragment, migrate, and reappear in unexpected forms. A line drawn by someone long gone can still carry information across centuries, even when its meaning has been forgotten. There is a strange quietness in the long stretches of time where nothing much seems to happen. When you lay out the broad timeline of human history, certain periods feel crowded. Names, sites, tools, cultures, migrations. Then there are other spans that feel almost empty by comparison. Thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years where the story slows down, thins out, and becomes harder to follow. These gaps are not dramatic. They don't announce themselves as mysteries. They simply exist as blank space between known points, and because of that, they're often overlooked. At first glance, the explanation seems straightforward. Fewer people lived then. Populations were smaller, more mobile, and left less behind. Over deep time, evidence erodes. Organic materials decay. Sites are buried or destroyed. Of course, there will be gaps, and that explanation is valid, as far as it goes. But when you start to look closely, the gaps don't always behave the way you'd expect them to. One of the most puzzling features of the human timeline is how uneven it is. Long periods appear technologically static, followed by sudden bursts of innovation. Tools remain largely unchanged for tens of thousands of years, then diversify rapidly. Social structures seem simple, then abruptly complex. Art appears, disappears, then reappears in new forms. It's not a smooth curve. It's a series of plateaus and jumps. This pattern raises a quiet question. Are these gaps real, reflecting actual stagnation or slow change? Or are they gaps in our visibility, places where evidence has thinned out or gone missing? The distinction matters, because the interpretation shapes how we understand human potential and history. Consider tool technology. Stone tools are among the most durable artifacts we have, and they dominate the deep record. For long stretches, the basic forms appear consistent. Simple flakes, hand axes, scrapers. Then, relatively suddenly, more refined tools emerge. Blades, composite tools, specialized implements. This is often framed as a cognitive leap, a moment where human intelligence took a decisive step forward, but intelligence doesn't usually jump overnight. Skills accumulate, techniques refine gradually. Knowledge passes from one group to another. The sudden appearance of advanced tools could reflect a genuine innovation, but it could also reflect preservation bias. Perhaps earlier experiments existed but were made from materials that didn't survive. Wood, bone, fibre. These leave far fainter traces than stone. If a culture relied heavily on organic technologies, its sophistication would be almost invisible to us. Its timeline would look sparse, even if daily life was rich with knowledge and skill. The gap would not reflect absence of activity, only absence of durable evidence. Migration adds another layer. Humans have moved repeatedly across continents. When populations relocate, they leave behind gaps. Sites are abandoned, new areas are settled. If migration coincides with environmental change, evidence can be further obscured. Rising seas swallow coastal settlements, advancing ice covers inland routes. Later erosion removes traces entirely. The timeline we reconstruct is not continuous. It's a patchwork stitched together from places where conditions happen to preserve material. That patchwork gives the illusion of pauses and leaps, when in reality activity may have been continuous but hidden. There are also demographic gaps. Genetic evidence suggests that human populations have gone through bottlenecks, periods where numbers dropped sharply. These could be caused by climate events, disease, or catastrophe. During bottlenecks, cultural diversity can collapse. Knowledge can be lost. When populations recover, they may reinvent rather than resume. Reinvention can look like sudden innovation. A tool reappears in a new form, not because it was just invented, but because it was rediscovered. Without written records, there's no way to know how many times something was learned, forgotten, and learned again. The timeline also contains geographic gaps. Some regions are well studied, others are barely explored. Political instability, dense vegetation, urban development, and simple lack of funding all limit research. Entire continents have uneven coverage. When evidence clusters in certain areas, it creates the impression that activity clustered there too. But absence of data is not absence of people. Climate history complicates things further. The last 100,000 years include dramatic shifts, ice ages, warming periods, abrupt climate events. These shifts alter where humans can live comfortably. They also affect preservation. Wet conditions destroy organic material. Dry conditions preserve it. A region that was once ideal for settlement may now be archaeologically silent because its climate destroyed evidence. This means the timeline is biased towards certain environments. Deserts, caves, and cold regions preserve more. Tropical forests preserve less. Coastal zones preserve almost nothing over long periods. If early complexity arose in now hostile environments, we would barely see it. There's also the issue of categorization. We divide the timeline into periods based on tool types or subsistence strategies. Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic. These categories are useful, but they can also obscure variation. They imply clear boundaries where there may have been none. Cultures don't switch modes overnight. They blend, overlap, and experiment. When evidence doesn't fit neatly into a category, it can be sidelined. An advanced-looking artifact in an early context becomes an anomaly rather than a signal. Enough anomalies might suggest a pattern, but individually they're easy to dismiss. The human brain prefers coherence. We like timelines that make sense. When confronted with gaps, we often fill them with assumptions rather than questions. We assume continuity of simplicity until complexity appears, because that's the simplest narrative. But simplicity of narrative is not the same as accuracy. Another puzzling feature is the recurrence of similar ideas across distant times and places. Agriculture appears independently in multiple regions. Monumental construction emerges in different contexts. Symbolic art arises, fades, and arises again. These patterns suggest that certain thresholds are crossed repeatedly. When conditions align, complexity emerges. If that's true, then it's reasonable to ask whether some thresholds were crossed earlier than we currently recognize, only to be reset by events that erased evidence. The timeline would then show gaps not because nothing happened, but because what happened didn't survive. There's also a subtle cultural bias at play. Written history looms large in our imagination. We treat writing as a dividing line between prehistory and history. Everything before writing feels vague. Everything after feels real. But writing is just one method of memory. Oral cultures can preserve detailed knowledge for generations, but that knowledge leaves little trace once the chain breaks. If a complex society relied on oral transmission, its collapse would erase its memory rapidly. Without inscriptions, libraries, or durable records, its timeline would collapse into silence. The gaps also appear when comparing biological and cultural timelines. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years. Behaviourally, modern humans, capable of symbolic thought and complex social organisation, appear relatively early. Yet large-scale civilization appears much later. This long delay is often explained by population density or environmental constraints. Those explanations are plausible, but they don't fully explain the variability. Why do some regions develop complexity earlier than others? Why do some experiments seem to fail? Why do similar conditions sometimes produce different outcomes? The timeline doesn't answer these questions cleanly. It hints at them, then moves on. It's also worth considering how catastrophic events might compress the timeline. A large-scale disaster doesn't just kill people, it disrupts knowledge networks, it breaks trade routes, it isolates groups. Over a few generations, technological regression can occur, not because people become less intelligent, but because systems that support complexity collapse. If such events occurred repeatedly, the timeline would show false restarts. Each recovery would look like a new beginning, even if it rested on forgotten foundations. Modern humans are accustomed to rapid change. We assume progress accelerates, but acceleration depends on continuity. Break continuity, and progress resets. The timeline we see may be a series of recoveries rather than a single ascent. There's also the issue of scale, once again. A civilization doesn't need to cover continents to matter. It doesn't need to leave pyramids or palaces. It could exist as a network of smaller settlements sharing knowledge, rituals and technology. Its footprint would be light. Its disappearance would be easy. When we look for gaps, we often look for absence of big things, cities, metals, writing. But complexity can exist without those markers. Social rules, astronomical knowledge, environmental management. These are hard to see archaeologically. Astronomy is a good example. Tracking seasons, solstices and cycles requires long-term observation and record-keeping, but not necessarily writing. Knowledge can be encoded in ritual, architecture or oral tradition. If those structures decay and traditions fade, the knowledge disappears without trace. The timeline then looks empty, even though minds were busy. There's also the issue of time compression in teaching and popular understanding. Tens of thousands of years are summarized in a few sentences. Nothing much changes becomes shorthand for, we don't have much evidence. Over time, that shorthand hardens into belief. Belief shapes expectation. Expectation shapes interpretation. This doesn't mean the gaps hide lost golden ages waiting to be uncovered. It means the gaps are exactly that. Gaps. Unknowns. Places where humility is appropriate. Science is comfortable with uncertainty, but public narratives often aren't. We prefer answers, even tentative ones. But deep time resists closure. It stretches beyond our intuitive grasp. When we sit with the puzzling gaps in the human timeline, something interesting happens. The past becomes less like a straight road and more like a landscape. Valleys of evidence, peaks of discovery, plateaus of assumption. Movement through that landscape is uneven. The question of whether we are Earth's first civilization doesn't hinge on filling every gap. It hinges on recognizing that the gaps exist, that they are large, and that they may hide more than emptiness. When an object turns up in the ground, it carries two kinds of information at once. There is what it is, and there is when it's supposed to belong. Most of the time, those two line up neatly. A stone scraper in a Paleolithic layer makes sense. A bronze tool in a Bronze Age context feels expected. The object fits the story, and the story absorbs it without resistance. But every so often, something appears that doesn't settle so easily. A tool that looks too refined, an artifact that seems too specialized, something that, according to the timeline we're using, arrives before it should have learned how to exist. This is what makes tools and artifacts so quietly disruptive. Unlike myths or maps, they are tangible. You can hold them, measure them, analyze their wear patterns. They are not abstract ideas or symbolic representations. They were made to do something, and because of that, they force a very practical question. Who made this and how? The problem of being too early doesn't usually announce itself with dramatic discoveries. It tends to appear at the margins, anomalies in collections, items set aside because they're difficult to classify, objects labelled with cautious phrases like out of context or intrusive. These labels are not dishonest. They reflect real uncertainty, but they also function as containment. They keep the anomaly from spreading too far into the larger picture. One of the most common examples involves stone tools that show unexpected levels of refinement. Not just sharp edges, but consistent shaping, symmetry, and evidence of repeated technique. Tools that look standardized, as if produced by people who knew exactly what they were making and why. This implies planning, skill, and teaching. It suggests that the toolmaker was not experimenting, but executing a known process. When such tools appear earlier than expected, the usual response is to question the dating. Maybe the layer was disturbed. Maybe the object moved downward through cracks or burrows. Maybe it was dropped later and worked its way into older sediment. All of these things do happen. Archaeologists are well aware of site disturbance. The problem arises when similar tools appear repeatedly in similarly early contexts across different locations. At that point, coincidence becomes less convincing. But still, the bar for revising timelines is high, and rightly so. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary care. No one wants to redraw history based on a handful of puzzling objects. The difficulty is that tools are often found in isolation. A single artifact rarely rewrites anything. Context is everything, but context itself can be fragile. Layers erode, sites are incomplete, excavations cover only small areas. The absence of a surrounding toolkit can make a single advanced-looking tool appear suspicious, even if it was genuinely part of a larger system that simply didn't preserve. Another complication is material choice. Stone dominates the early record because it survives, but stone tools are only part of any technological system. Wood, bone, plant fibres, resins and hides would have been equally important. These materials allow for complex tools that leave little trace. A spear shaft, a bow, a net, or a woven container can be sophisticated without leaving behind much more than a stone tip or a fragment. If a culture relied heavily on organic materials, its technological complexity would be underrepresented archaeologically. What survives would look simple, even if daily life was not. A finely shaped stone blade might be just one component of a much more elaborate tool we no longer see. This creates a bias where surviving artifacts appear either crude or inexplicably advanced. The middle ground, where organic complexity once existed, disappears. Wear analysis adds another layer to the problem. By examining microscopic wear patterns on tools, researchers can infer how they were used. Cutting meat leaves different marks than scraping hides or working wood. In some cases, tools found in very early contexts show wear consistent with specialized tasks. Not general purpose hacking, but repeated controlled actions. Specialization implies knowledge. It implies that someone understood not just how to make the tool, but how to apply it efficiently. That understanding doesn't arise spontaneously. It develops through practice and tradition. Then there are composite tools, objects made from multiple materials assembled together. These are harder to detect archaeologically because only the most durable components survive. A stone blade that was once hafted into a wooden handle with resin and fibre might now appear as a simple blade, but the very existence of that blade, shaped in a particular way, might only make sense as part of a composite system. When composite tool traditions exist, technological leaps can appear sudden in the stone record. In reality, the leap may have occurred in organic materials long before, invisible to us. Artifacts beyond tools raise similar issues. Decorative objects, beads, carvings, and symbols appear earlier than once believed. These suggest abstract thinking, social signalling, and cultural continuity. But even here, the record is uneven. Burials with grave goods appear sporadically, then vanish. Art flourishes, then seems to retreat. The retreat is puzzling. Once a behaviour emerges, why does it disappear? One explanation is population movement. Another is cultural change. But another possibility is that the evidence simply doesn't survive in certain contexts. Organic art, body painting, tattoos, performance, and ritual leave little behind. When objects do survive, they can feel strangely out of place. A finely drilled bead in a very old layer, a shaped piece of ochre used consistently over long periods. These are often accepted now, but they were once controversial. Each acceptance required adjusting expectations. Metal artifacts introduce even more tension. Metalworking is usually placed relatively late in the human story. It requires high temperatures, controlled environments, and knowledge of ores. When metal objects appear in early contexts, skepticism intensifies. Some early metal finds are explained as meteoritic iron that fell from the sky, already metallic, shaped cold rather than smelted. This explanation is plausible and supported in some cases, but even cold-working meteoritic iron requires recognition, experimentation, and skill. It suggests an eye for unusual materials and the ability to exploit them. Occasionally, metal objects appear that don't fit even that explanation cleanly. Their composition suggests smelting. Their shapes suggest functional use rather than ornament. These cases are rare and debated fiercely. Many are ultimately rejected as intrusive or misdated. But the debates themselves reveal how sensitive the timeline is to such finds. Another issue is standardization. When tools or artifacts appear standardized, it suggests production beyond individual improvisation. Standards require agreement. Agreement implies social structure. It implies that people were trained to make things the same way, perhaps for compatibility or efficiency. Standardization appearing early challenges the assumption that early societies were loosely organized. It suggests coordination, even if informal. There's also the question of repair and maintenance. Some tools show evidence of resharpening, modification, and reuse. This implies long-term value placed on the object. It suggests foresight, planning for future use. These are not trivial behaviours. They reflect a mindset oriented toward continuity. The phrase "too early" is revealing. It implies that we know the correct order of development, and the object is violating it. But the order itself is inferred, not observed directly. It's built from surviving evidence, which is incomplete by nature. When an artifact challenges the order, there are only a few options. The artifact is misinterpreted, the context is misdated, or the order needs adjustment. Science prefers the first two until the third becomes unavoidable. This conservatism is not a flaw. It protects against error. But it can also slow recognition of real patterns. Another factor complicating interpretation is the reuse of objects. A tool made at one time can be picked up and reused thousands of years later. This can create misleading contexts, but reuse usually leaves signs, where patterns from different periods, polishing inconsistent with the original manufacture. Skilled analysis can often distinguish reuse from original placement. Still, not always. Ambiguity remains. The public perception of these issues is often distorted. Popular accounts tend to highlight extreme claims, ignoring the careful incremental nature of actual research. This creates a false dichotomy. Either everything fits perfectly, or everything is wrong. Reality is quieter. It's a slow negotiation between evidence and interpretation. Most archaeologists spend their careers working within the timeline, refining it, not overthrowing it. They are not blind to anomalies. They catalogue them, discuss them, argue about them. But they also know how often anomalies dissolve under closer scrutiny. What's interesting is not that some anomalies turn out to be mistakes. That's expected. What's interesting is that some survive scrutiny and become accepted. When that happens, the timeline shifts slightly. The past gets a little deeper, a little more complex. Over the last century, this has happened repeatedly. Humans appeared earlier than thought. Symbolic behaviour emerged earlier. Long-distance trade existed earlier. Each adjustment was once controversial. Now it's textbook. This pattern suggests caution in dismissing all early artifacts outright. It suggests that some may be ahead of their time simply because our model lags behind reality. There's also the issue of regional variation. Development does not occur everywhere at the same pace. One region may innovate earlier, another later. When artifacts are compared across regions, something can appear too early, simply because it doesn't match the dominant narrative built around a different area. The timeline we often use is not global. It's a patchwork dominated by a few well-studied regions. When evidence from elsewhere doesn't fit, it can feel disruptive even if it's perfectly valid. Another subtle problem is expectation of linear progression. We expect tools to get better in a straight line. But improvement can plateau. Techniques can be lost. Simpler tools can coexist with more complex ones because they're sufficient for the task. A society might choose not to adopt certain technologies even if it could. Choice is often underestimated in discussions of the past. Not every innovation is inevitable. This matters because when a refined tool appears early, it doesn't necessarily mean a full technological system existed alongside it. It could represent a peak of a particular craft that later declined, or a specialised tradition that didn't spread widely. The archaeological record tends to favour widespread practices. Rare traditions can vanish without trace, leaving behind only a few objects that look inexplicable. The emotional weight of these artefacts comes from their intimacy. A tool fits in a hand. It was shaped by someone with muscles, attention and intention. It carries the imprint of a mind at work. When that mind seems to belong to a time we've labelled as simple, it creates dissonance. That dissonance doesn't demand resolution. It invites patience. It reminds us that labels like early and advanced are conveniences, not laws of nature. Stories last longer than buildings. They don't depend on stone or metal. They live in voices, in repetition, in the habit of telling the same thing again and again until it becomes part of how a people understands the world. Because of that, myths are often treated as unreliable sources of history. They change, they exaggerate, they borrow, they adapt, and all of that is true. But there's another side to them that's easy to miss when we dismiss them too quickly. Myths are not random. They are structured. They persist for reasons. And sometimes, when you listen carefully, they sound less like pure invention and more like memory that has been stretched by time. Most cultures tell stories about beginnings, about floods, fires, collapses and renewals, about earlier ages that were different from the present one, sometimes better, sometimes worse, often more powerful. These stories appear across continents, among people who had no contact with one another for thousands of years. The similarities are not exact, but they rhyme in ways that are difficult to ignore once you start paying attention. The comfortable explanation is that humans share the same fears and hopes, so we invent similar stories. Floods are frightening, so flood myths appear everywhere. The sky feels powerful, so gods come from the sky. That explanation accounts for part of it, but not all, because some myths contain details that are oddly specific. Geographic details, environmental details, social details, things that feel anchored to particular experiences rather than universal psychology. Take flood stories. They're among the most widespread myths on Earth. From Mesopotamia to South Asia, from the Americas to Oceania, cultures speak of great floods that wiped out previous worlds. Not just local floods, but world-ending ones. Waters rising suddenly, people warned in advance, survivors preserving knowledge or life in some way. The repetition alone is striking, but what makes it more interesting is how some of these stories line up with real geological events. Sea levels did rise dramatically at the end of the last ice age. Coastlines flooded. Entire regions disappeared underwater. For people living near those coasts, the experience would have felt total. Their entire world would have vanished. That kind of event leaves an imprint. Even if the story changes over generations, the core memory remains. Now imagine not just one flood, but multiple catastrophic events over tens of thousands of years. Glacial lake outbursts, tsunamis triggered by earthquakes or impacts. Rapid climate shifts causing sudden meltwater pulses. Each event reshapes the landscape. Each one displaces populations. Over time, stories merge. Separate disasters blur into a single narrative of destruction and rebirth. In that light, flood myths stop looking like fantasies and start looking like compressed history. Not history in the modern sense of dates and documentation, but history as lived experience, remembered emotionally rather than precisely. Then there are myths about earlier ages of humanity. Many traditions describe cycles. A golden age, a silver age, a fallen age. Sometimes humans are said to have lived longer, known more, built greater things. Then something happened, a transgression, a catastrophe, a forgetting. The present world is framed as a diminished version of what came before. These stories are often dismissed as nostalgia or moral allegory, a way of explaining suffering or decline, and they certainly function that way. But again, the pattern is widespread. Independent cultures describe similar sequences, a time before time, a break, a reset. What's interesting is that these myths rarely describe a slow decline. They describe abrupt endings, floods, fires, shaking earth, sky events, things that happen suddenly and irrevocably. That aligns more closely with catastrophic disruption than with gradual cultural evolution. There are also myths that describe knowledge being lost, fire stolen, writing taken away, skills forgotten, survivors starting over with less than they had before. This is not the narrative of inevitable progress, it's the narrative of interruption. In some traditions, the gods are not creators so much as teachers. They arrive, bring knowledge, establish laws, then leave or withdraw. Later generations live in the shadow of that lost instruction. This framing is often interpreted metaphorically, but it could also reflect a real cultural memory of knowledge transfer from a more complex society to a simpler one after collapse. Even when gods are clearly symbolic, the structure of the story matters. Knowledge is framed as something that once existed fully, then fragmented, not something that was slowly discovered from ignorance. Another recurring theme is the idea of a previous humanity. Beings who lived before the current people, sometimes larger, sometimes wiser, sometimes more advanced. They are wiped out, replaced, or diminished. These beings are not always gods. Sometimes they are simply earlier humans. Sometimes they are described as different, but recognizably similar. In some indigenous traditions, there are stories of people before the people. Not supernatural, just earlier. They built things. They made mistakes. They disappeared. The current inhabitants inherit the land, sometimes the ruins, sometimes just the cautionary tales. These stories are often localized. They reference specific places, mountains, valleys, rivers, stones. The land itself becomes a character in the story, holding memory even when people forget. This ties back to the idea of the ground remembering something else. Myth and landscape reinforce each other. There are also myths that seem oddly technical. Stories describing the movement of stars, cycles of the sun and moon, precession, or long periods of time. Some ancient myths encode astronomical knowledge with surprising accuracy. Again, this doesn't require advanced instruments. Long-term observation is enough, but it does require continuity. Generations watching, recording, and transmitting information carefully. If such knowledge was lost at some point, the myth might survive while the method disappears. The story remains, but the explanation fades. What was once practical knowledge becomes sacred narrative. One reason myths are treated cautiously is that they change. Details shift, characters merge, timelines compress. That's true. But compression itself can be informative. When a myth collapses centuries into a single event, it suggests that something significant happened that marked the boundary between before and after. The specifics may blur, but the boundary remains sharp. Oral traditions are particularly vulnerable to disruption. They require living communities to carry them. When populations fragment, languages die, or people are displaced, stories break. Fragments survive in altered forms. Pieces are borrowed by neighbouring groups. Meanings shift, but traces remain. What's striking is that despite this fragility, some mythic themes persist for astonishing lengths of time. That suggests they were reinforced repeatedly, either because the stories were useful, or because they were anchored to recurring experiences, or because they were tied to physical landmarks that kept reminding people. Fire myths are another example. Stories of fire being brought to humans, stolen or rediscovered. Fire is central to human survival. Losing it would be catastrophic. Relearning it would be transformative. A society that lost fire-making knowledge and later regained it would likely encode that experience deeply. The same applies to agriculture. Some myths describe humans being taught how to grow crops by gods or ancestral figures. Others describe agriculture as a punishment or a fall from an easier life. These stories may reflect transitions between ways of living, nomadic to settled, foraging to farming, or perhaps recovery after collapse. The difficulty is that myth does not come with timestamps. We cannot easily align a story with a specific archaeological layer. That makes it tempting to dismiss myth as non-evidence. But myth operates on a different timescale. It preserves significance, not sequence. In some cases, myths preserve surprisingly accurate environmental details, descriptions of animals that no longer exist in the region, landscapes that no longer match current geography, water where there is now desert, ice where there is now forest. These details can sometimes be correlated with paleoclimate data. When they are, the myth gains weight as a memory of real conditions. Australian Aboriginal stories are often cited here, not because they are unique, but because they are well studied. Some describe sea level rise that occurred thousands of years ago, preserved through oral tradition. The stories changed, but the core event remained recognisable. That sets a precedent. If such memory can persist for thousands of years, longer persistence is not impossible. Memory, however, is not neutral. It is shaped by meaning. Events that threaten survival are remembered more strongly. Events that reshape identity leave deeper marks. A collapse of a civilization, even a regional one, would be exactly that kind of event. This raises a quiet possibility. Some myths may not be about the dawn of humanity, but about the end of something. Not creation stories, but destruction stories. Stories told by survivors trying to explain why the world no longer looks the way it once did. The idea of survivors is important. Many myths emphasize a small group that makes it through the catastrophe. A family, a pair, a chosen few. This is often interpreted morally. The righteous survive, the wicked perish. But it can also reflect demographic reality. After a disaster, populations bottleneck, only a fraction remain. From their perspective, everyone else is gone. Survivors carry stories forward, but they also simplify them. Complexity is hard to maintain when resources are scarce. Stories become shorter, meanings condense, technical knowledge becomes symbolic. This process doesn't require advanced civilization to begin with. It only requires a disruption large enough to sever continuity. Another theme that recurs is forbidden knowledge. Stories warn against certain technologies or behaviours, people reaching too high, building too much, angering the forces of nature. These are often read as moral lessons, and they are, but they may also encode practical caution learned the hard way. A society that overexploited its environment and collapsed might pass down a story framing that collapse as punishment. Over time, the specifics fade, but the warning remains. It's also worth noticing how myths treat ruins. In many traditions, ancient structures are attributed to giants, gods, or ancestors. Not because people believed literally in giants, but because the builders were imagined as different from current people, more powerful, more capable. This could reflect real technological or organisational differences rather than supernatural ones. When later populations encounter ruins they cannot replicate, they explain the difference mythologically. That doesn't mean the ruins were built by gods, it means the knowledge to build them was lost. Myth becomes a bridge between what is visible and what is no longer understood. The modern discomfort with taking myths seriously comes partly from the history of misuse. Myths have been weaponized to justify false narratives. That makes caution necessary. But caution does not require dismissal. It requires discernment. Listening to myth does not mean treating it as literal fact. It means treating it as data of a different kind. Cultural data, psychological data, memory data. When multiple myths from different cultures echo the same themes, especially themes that align with known environmental events, it's reasonable to ask whether they preserve fragments of shared human experience, not shared in the sense of a single origin, but shared in the sense of recurring cycles. Civilization, if it rises and falls, would leave behind more than rubble. It would leave behind stories, not detailed blueprints but impressions, warnings, longings, explanations shaped by emotion rather than precision. The question is not whether myths prove that we are not Earth's first civilization. They don't. Proof requires stronger anchors. The question is whether myths are consistent with that possibility, and in many cases they are. They describe worlds before ours. They describe loss of knowledge. They describe survivors starting again. They describe a sense that something important came before and did not fully carry over. That sense alone is not evidence, but it is not meaningless either. It aligns uncomfortably well with the idea of cultural amnesia following collapse. History is often presented as a forward march, but when you step back far enough, the movement looks less like a straight line and more like a repeating pattern. Growth, complexity, expansion, then strain, instability, breakdown, and finally, something quieter than destruction. Forgetting. Not the dramatic kind where everything burns at once, but the slow, ordinary kind where knowledge fades because there is no longer a reason or ability to maintain it. We know this pattern well on small scales. Empires rise and fall, cities grow wealthy, then hollow out. Trade networks expand, then fracture. Languages spread, then splinter, then disappear. None of this is controversial. It's the basic rhythm of recorded history. What becomes more uncomfortable is extending that rhythm further back, beyond writing, beyond monuments, into periods where memory relies entirely on continuity. Collapse does not have to mean apocalypse. More often it looks like simplification. Systems that require coordination break down first. Long-distance trade shrinks. Specialised labour becomes impractical. Technologies that depend on supply chains or precise knowledge stop being reproducible. What remains are the tools and practices that can be maintained locally, with minimal infrastructure. From the outside, this looks like regression. From the inside, it looks like survival. Imagine a society with skilled builders, navigators, astronomers, and planners. Now imagine that society losing population rapidly due to climate stress, disease, or environmental change. The immediate concern is food, shelter, safety. Maintaining large stone structures or teaching advanced techniques becomes secondary. Knowledge that isn't immediately useful becomes fragile. Within a few generations, entire skill sets can vanish, not because people become less intelligent, but because intelligence is always applied to the present moment. If there is no longer a reason to measure the stars precisely, that knowledge fades. If there is no longer a reason to quarry massive stone, those techniques are forgotten. What remains are fragments, stories, ruins, tools repurposed without full understanding of how they were made. Archaeology shows this process repeatedly in known civilizations. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, large-scale infrastructure decayed. Roads fell into disrepair. Concrete formulas were lost. Literacy declined in many regions. None of this happened overnight. It unfolded gradually, unevenly, and quietly. Yet within a few centuries, vast amounts of practical knowledge had vanished from everyday life. Importantly, the people living through this transition did not experience it as a fall from greatness. They experienced it as normality. Each generation inherits a world slightly simpler than the one before, and that world feels complete to them. Memory of earlier complexity becomes abstract, mythologized, or irrelevant. Now extend that process across longer spans of time, tens of thousands of years instead of hundreds. Add environmental forces far more severe than political instability, ice ages advancing and retreating, sea levels rising rapidly, volcanic winters, prolonged droughts. Each event disrupts continuity in different ways. A single collapse can be absorbed. Multiple collapses, spaced irregularly, produce something else entirely. Cultural amnesia. Quiet forgetting is the key here. Not everything is forgotten at once. Certain practices persist because they are robust. Basic tool making, fire use, social bonding, storytelling. Other practices require conditions that no longer exist. Those disappear first. The archaeological record reflects this selectivity. What we find are the things that survive both collapse and time. Stone tools, durable structures, rarely the systems that gave them meaning. This can create the illusion that society started simple and slowly built up complexity. In reality, complexity may have risen and fallen multiple times, with each fall stripping away layers until only the most basic elements remained. There is also the issue of scale. A civilization does not need to be global to experience collapse. Regional systems can rise and fall independently. One area may flourish, while another struggles. Knowledge can be localized. When that locality fails, its contributions vanish from the broader record. Consider a network of settlements sharing techniques, rituals, and knowledge. If that network fragments due to environmental change, each node becomes isolated. Over time, differences grow, shared standards erode. What was once a coherent system becomes a patchwork of local traditions. From the perspective of deep time, that coherence disappears entirely. Later observers see only scattered remnants, if anything at all. This is particularly important when thinking about prehistory, where writing is absent. Writing acts as a stabilizer. It allows knowledge to persist beyond the lives of individuals. Without it, continuity depends entirely on uninterrupted social transmission. Interrupt that transmission, and the knowledge is gone. Collapse also reshapes values. What a society considers important before a crisis may not matter afterward. Monumental architecture may be abandoned. Long-term planning may give way to short-term adaptation. Technologies that once signalled status may become burdens. Archaeologically, this looks like simplification. Tools become smaller, less specialised. Settlements become more mobile. Art becomes rarer or changes form. To later observers, this looks like a step backward, but is often a rational response to changed conditions. Over long periods, Repeated simplification followed by reorganization can produce cycles that look like separate beginnings. Each recovery appears as a fresh start, even if it rests on buried foundations. This is where the idea of quiet forgetting becomes especially relevant. Forgetting is not always total. Sometimes it's partial. A technique survives, but its origin is forgotten. A structure remains, but its purpose is unclear. A story persists, but its original context is lost. Myths often fill this gap. They provide explanations when memory fails. Giants built the stones. Gods taught the skills. Ancestors lived differently. These explanations preserve the sense that something came before, even when details are gone. From a scientific perspective, myth is not data in the same way stone or bone is, but it is evidence of perception. It tells us how later people understood the past they inherited, if they consistently framed that past as more capable or different. That perception itself is meaningful. There's also the question of how collapse interacts with environment. A society adapted to one climate regime may struggle when that regime shifts. The end of the last ice age brought dramatic changes. Melting ice sheets altered weather patterns, sea levels rose, habitats changed, resources shifted. Groups that thrived under one set of conditions may have been forced to adapt quickly or relocate. Not all adaptations succeed. Some knowledge becomes irrelevant. Some technologies no longer work. New solutions are required. In this process, specialization becomes a liability. Generalist skills survive better than niche ones. A society that had mastered complex stone construction might abandon it if mobility becomes more important. Over time, the ability to build in stone disappears, not because it was impossible, but because it was unnecessary. Later, when stability returns, stone building may re-emerge independently. From the archaeological record, this looks like invention rather than rediscovery. Another factor is population density. Complex systems require enough people to support them. Drop below a threshold and complexity collapses. This doesn't require total extinction. A reduction of population can be enough to unravel networks. Genetic studies suggest that human populations have passed through severe bottlenecks, periods when numbers dropped dramatically. These bottlenecks coincide roughly with environmental stress. During such times, cultural diversity shrinks. Knowledge pools narrow. When populations expand again, they do so from a reduced base. What was lost during the bottleneck does not automatically return. This dynamic complicates the idea of continuous progress. It suggests that progress is conditional, not guaranteed. It depends on stability, redundancy, and memory. Remove those, and even advanced systems can vanish. There's also the problem of archaeological visibility once again. Collapse does not leave clear markers. Destruction layers are dramatic, but many collapses leave none. Settlements are abandoned gradually. Materials are reused. Sites are scavenged. Over time, the physical footprint becomes faint. Quiet forgetting leaves little trace. It is archaeologically subtle. It looks like absence rather than evidence. This subtlety makes it easy to underestimate how often collapse has occurred. We notice the dramatic ends. We miss the slow dissolutions. When thinking about whether we are Earth's first civilization, this matters deeply. The question is not whether a previous civilization left grand ruins everywhere. The question is whether cycles of rise and collapse could erase most traces over deep time. Given what we know about erosion, climate change, tectonics, and human behaviour, the answer is clearly yes. Erasure is not only possible, it is likely. This does not mean that advanced global civilizations flourished repeatedly and vanished without a trace. That claim would require much stronger evidence. But it does mean that regional complexity could rise earlier than we currently recognise and be lost in ways that leave behind only ambiguous remnants. It also means that our confidence in a single, uninterrupted ascent should be tempered. The archaeological record is not a complete archive. It is a survival record. What we see is what made it through both collapse and time. Quiet forgetting also shapes modern interpretation. When evidence is missing, narratives fill the gap. Those narratives harden into frameworks. Frameworks shape expectation. Expectation filters evidence. Breaking that cycle requires patience. It requires sitting with uncertainty without rushing to resolution. It requires accepting that some questions may remain open for a long time. The idea of cycles does not diminish human achievement. If anything, it highlights resilience. Each time complexity emerges, it does so against odds. Each time it is lost, something essential still survives. Language, social bonds, curiosity. From that perspective, the human story becomes less about a single climb and more about repeated attempts, each shaped by environment, chance and choice. Some attempts leave clearer traces than others. Ice does not care what came before it. Neither does water moving at the wrong speed, or fire fed by the right conditions, or rock shifted by forces deep below the surface. These elements don't discriminate between forests and cities, between homes and monuments, between memory and meaning. They erase impartially, and over long spans of time, they do it thoroughly enough that absence begins to look like innocence. Nothing here, therefore nothing ever was. That assumption feels natural. It is also deeply misleading. Start with ice, because it is one of the most effective erasers Earth has ever produced. Glaciers are slow, but they are relentless. They do not simply cover what lies beneath them. They grind it. They shear rock from mountains, drag it across landscapes, pulverize structures into sediment, and redeposit that material hundreds of kilometers away. A glacier passing over a settlement does not leave ruins. It leaves silence. During the last glacial maximum, massive ice sheets covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and large portions of Asia. These were not thin layers. They were kilometers thick in places. Anything beneath them was crushed, displaced, or buried so deeply that recovery becomes almost impossible. When the ice retreated, it did not reveal the past neatly. It left behind scoured bedrock, jumbled debris, and new terrain. If human populations lived in these regions before glaciation, evidence of their settlements would be minimal. Caves might survive. Isolated stone tools might be found far from where they were used, carried by ice and meltwater. Context would be destroyed. The story would be fragmented beyond easy recognition. Even more subtle is what happens at the edges of ice sheets. Freeze-thaw cycles fracture stone. Permafrost heaves the ground, disturbing layers repeatedly. Seasonal meltwater floods valleys, redepositing sediment over and over again. Over thousands of years, this constant motion rearranges the surface until earlier occupation becomes indistinguishable from background noise. Ice also reshapes rivers. Meltwater creates massive outflows, carving new channels and abandoning old ones. Entire drainage systems change course. Settlements built along former rivers may find themselves stranded far from water or submerged beneath new deposits. Later observers see empty land and assume it was always so. Then there is the ocean, which erases differently, but no less completely. Sea level rise is not gentle when viewed from the perspective of a coastline. During periods of rapid melting, water can rise meters in a human lifetime. Shorelines retreat, lowlands flood, estuaries form. Saltwater intrudes into freshwater systems. For people living in these regions, the world quite literally disappears beneath their feet. Coastal zones are among the most attractive places to live. They offer abundant food, transportation routes, and stable climates. It would be surprising if early human societies did not concentrate there. It would be even more surprising if those societies left much behind once the sea claimed their land. Underwater preservation is unpredictable. Some materials survive remarkably well in low oxygen environments. Others vanish quickly. Structures collapse under pressure. Currents scatter debris. Sediment builds unevenly. What remains is often difficult to interpret, especially without extensive excavation. Large portions of the continental shelves remain unexplored in detail. These submerged landscapes were dry land for most of human history. Rivers flowed there, Lakes formed, people lived there, yet for practical reasons they are largely absent from our archaeological narratives. It is not that nothing is there, it is that access is limited, expensive, and slow. The ocean also erases memory by reshaping coastlines continuously. A settlement built near the shore 20,000 years ago might now lie tens of kilometres offshore. Its relationship to the land is gone. Without knowing where to look, it remains invisible. Catastrophic flooding adds another layer. Not all floods are gradual. Some are sudden and immense. Glacial lake outbursts release enormous volumes of water in short periods. Tsunamis generated by earthquakes or impacts can inundate coastlines far inland. These events leave behind chaotic deposits that bury and destroy surface evidence. A flood does not preserve a city the way volcanic ash sometimes does. It mixes materials, tears structures apart, and redeposits fragments in new configurations. Later layers settle over the mess, smoothing it out. To an archaeologist thousands of years later, it looks like natural sediment. Fire erases differently again. Wildfires can burn structures quickly, leaving behind little more than ash and charcoal. In some cases, fire preserves, hardening clay or sealing layers. In others, it obliterates organic material entirely. Repeated fires over centuries can remove all traces of occupation, except subtle chemical signals in the soil. Volcanic activity is dramatic, but its long-term effects are often underestimated. Lava flows bury landscapes. Ash blankets regions, collapsing roofs and smothering vegetation. Over time, ash compacts and becomes part of the geological record. If a settlement is buried deeply enough, it may survive. If not, it is destroyed and incorporated into new layers indistinguishable from natural deposits. Volcanoes also alter climate. Large eruptions can trigger short-term cooling, crop failures, and population stress far from the eruption site. These indirect effects can cause societal collapse without leaving a clear archaeological signature linking cause and effect. Earthquakes are another quiet eraser. They collapse buildings, but more importantly, they rearrange the ground. Faulting can uplift or drop entire regions. Liquefaction turns solid ground into slurry, mixing layers and destroying context. Coastal earthquakes can cause sudden subsidence, dropping settlements below sea level in moments. In some places, entire ancient cities now lie underwater, not because of gradual sea level rise, but because the land itself sank. To later generations, these cities were simply gone. Meteor impacts, while rare, are the most indiscriminate erasers of all. Even relatively small impacts can cause widespread devastation. Shockwaves flatten forests. Fires ignite across continents. Tsunamis radiate outward. Dust and aerosols alter climate. If such an event occurred during a period of human habitation, the effects would be severe and long-lasting. Evidence of impacts is often subtle. Craters erode, impact signatures disperse. Unless an impact is large and recent, it may not be obvious in the geological record. Yet its consequences could reshape human history profoundly. What all of these forces share is scale. They operate on scales that dwarf human construction. No matter how carefully built, no matter how monumental, human works are fragile in comparison. Given enough time and disturbance, even the most robust structures disappear. This is why the absence of evidence in certain periods or regions cannot be taken as evidence of absence. The conditions for preservation are specific and rare. They require stability. They require protection from erosion, water, ice, and human reuse. They require luck. Luck is not evenly distributed across time or space. Consider how many known archaeological sites were discovered by accident. Construction projects, quarrying, road building. Without those disturbances, the sites would remain unknown. How many more lie untouched beneath forests, fields, and cities? Now consider how many sites were destroyed before archaeology existed. How many were quarried for stone? How many were ploughed under? How many were eroded away before anyone thought to look? Deep time magnifies this loss. Over tens of thousands of years, the cumulative effect of ice, water, fire, and tectonics is immense. Landscapes are recycled. The surface we walk on today is not the surface early humans walked on. It is younger, often much younger. This has implications for how we interpret the human story. We tend to assume that earlier periods were simpler because we see less. But what if we see less because less survived? The forces that erase also shape what survives. Caves preserve better than open plains. Deserts preserve better than forests. Stable plateaus preserve better than coastlines. This creates a biased archive. Certain kinds of societies become overrepresented. Others vanish. A highly mobile coastal society could be archaeologically almost invisible after sea level rise. A forest-based society using organic materials could leave almost nothing behind. A society that built modestly but managed its environment skillfully might leave fewer traces than one that extracted aggressively. Catastrophe does not only erase structures, it erases continuity. Knowledge transmission breaks, languages fragment, social networks collapse. When survivors adapt, they do so with what remains. The past becomes distant even if it was once advanced. This is how quiet forgetting accelerates, not just through time, but through disruption. The important point is not that catastrophe guarantees loss of all evidence, it is that catastrophe makes loss likely, uneven, and selective. Some things survive, most do not. What survives shapes the narrative. When we look back and see long stretches with little evidence, we are seeing the result of these erasing forces at work. We are seeing what made it through multiple filters. What did not make it through is unknown. Understanding this does not mean abandoning rigour. It means calibrating expectations. It means recognising that the archaeological record is not a complete ledger, but a partial one, heavily edited by Earth itself. This perspective does not prove that earlier civilizations existed, but it removes a major objection to the idea, the objection that says, if they existed, we would see them everywhere. No, we would see them where conditions allowed. Elsewhere, we would see silence. As we move forward, the question becomes more focused. Given how thoroughly Earth can erase, what kinds of traces might realistically survive? What would be subtle rather than obvious? And how might modern science detect them, even when they do not announce themselves as cities or monuments? It feels like a bold question at first, almost rhetorical. Could a civilization truly vanish without a trace? Not decline, not transform, not leave behind scattered ruins or fragments, but disappear so completely that later generations would have no clear evidence it ever existed? The instinctive answer is no. It feels unreasonable. Surely something would remain. A wall, a tool, a scar on the land. Something solid enough to anchor the idea in reality. That instinct comes from living in a world saturated with material evidence. We are surrounded by objects, buildings, roads, waste, data. It's difficult to imagine all of this disappearing, but that difficulty says more about our perspective than about what time and Earth are capable of doing together. To approach the question seriously, it helps to strip away dramatic imagery and think in practical terms. What do civilizations actually consist of? People, first and foremost, then systems. Ways of organizing labor, sharing knowledge, producing food, building shelter, and passing meaning from one generation to the next. Physical structures are part of that, but they are not the whole of it, and they are often not the most resilient part. Most human activity is ephemeral. Conversations, decisions, skills performed rather than recorded. Even today, much of what makes civilization function exists only while people actively maintain it. When that maintenance stops, decay begins immediately. Take a modern city and imagine it abandoned. Within days, systems fail. Power grids shut down, water systems stagnate, Within months, vegetation begins to reclaim spaces. Within decades, structures weaken. Within centuries, much of what defined the city becomes unrecognizable. Stretch that process across thousands of years, add climate change, geological activity, and human reuse, and the outline fades rapidly. Now, imagine a civilization that never built at modern scale, one that used mostly organic materials, one that favoured adaptation over permanence, one that did not carve its identity into massive stone monuments. That civilization would leave behind far less to begin with. The assumption that civilization must always announce itself physically is a modern one. It is shaped by our own habits. We build to last because we can. We mark territory because we value ownership and legacy. But those values are not universal or inevitable. A society focused on balance rather than expansion might intentionally minimize its footprint. It might build structures meant to be dismantled. It might avoid extracting resources in ways that leave permanent scars. It might encode knowledge in stories, practices, and rituals rather than objects. From an archaeological perspective, such a civilization would be difficult to detect even if it lasted thousands of years. Its disappearance would not look like collapse, it would look like absence. There is also the issue of scale again. Civilization does not require millions of people, it requires coordination. A regional network of tens of thousands could sustain complex knowledge, trade, and culture. If that network fragmented, its traces would scatter. Without large population centres, there would be no single site to excavate and declare definitive. The idea of vanishing without a trace also depends on what we consider a trace. We often think in terms of discrete artefacts, tools, buildings, inscriptions. But traces can also be diffuse, altered ecosystems, changed species distributions, soil chemistry, genetic signatures. These are harder to interpret as cultural evidence, especially after long periods. For example, sustained agriculture alters soil structure. It changes nutrient profiles. It reshapes plant communities. If agriculture is later abandoned and forests return, some of those changes persist, but they are subtle. Without context, they may be attributed to natural variation. Fire management is another example. Humans have used fire deliberately for tens of thousands of years. Controlled burning shapes, landscapes. It influences which plants dominate. Over time, these practices can transform entire regions. If the practice stops, the landscape changes again, but echoes remain. Distinguishing between natural and human-driven change over deep time is challenging. It requires careful comparison and often yields ambiguous results. A vanished civilization might leave behind such ecological fingerprints without leaving recognizable artifacts. There's also the matter of reuse. Humans rarely leave materials untouched. Later groups often scavenge what came before. Stone is reused, metal is melted down, foundations are dismantled. Even in recent history, ancient structures have been quarried to build newer ones. Over time, reuse erases origin. If a civilization collapses and later populations occupy the same land, they may incorporate remnants without understanding their source. A stone block becomes just a stone, a worked piece is reshaped. Context disappears. This process accelerates erasure rather than preserving it. Language loss compounds the problem. Place names preserve memory. They anchor stories to locations. When languages die, those anchors vanish. A hill once known as something meaningful becomes just a hill. Without the name, the story fades faster. Writing, when it exists, slows forgetting, but writing itself is fragile. Manuscripts burn, materials decay, scripts fall out of use. Without continuous copying, written knowledge disappears. Entire literatures have been lost in recorded history. Over deep time, the loss is far greater. Consider how much of ancient literature we know only by reference. Works mentioned but not preserved. Knowledge acknowledged but missing. That loss occurred within civilizations that valued writing and record keeping. Imagine the loss in cultures that did not. Another factor often overlooked is intentional erasure. Sometimes societies actively destroy traces of what came before. They dismantle monuments, they suppress stories, they rewrite origin narratives. This can be driven by ideology, religion, or the desire to legitimize new power structures. In such cases, forgetting is not accidental. It is purposeful. Over generations, the reasons for erasure fade, but the absence remains. This does not require malice. It can happen simply through neglect. A ruin associated with an old belief system may no longer be maintained. Over time, it collapses. Later generations inherit only rubble, then nothing at all. The idea that something could vanish without a trace also depends on how narrowly we define civilization. If we equate civilization strictly with large cities, writing, and metallurgy, then yes, traces would likely remain. But if we broaden the definition to include complex social organization, knowledge systems, environmental management, and symbolic culture, then physical traces become less guaranteed. A civilization can be advanced in ways that do not fossilize well. There is also a tendency to imagine collapse as singular and total. One disaster, one end. In reality, collapse is often staggered. Different regions fail at different times. Some knowledge survives longer than others. The end result, from a distant future perspective, is a smeared signal rather than a clean break. This smearing makes reconstruction difficult. Instead of a clear layer marking a civilization's existence, there are faint hints spread across time and space. No single hint is convincing on its own. Together, they might suggest something, but only if we're willing to look for patterns rather than proofs. This is where scientific caution becomes both necessary and limiting. Science requires strong evidence. That standard protects against error. But it also means that phenomena which leave weak, diffuse traces are hard to acknowledge. They fall below the threshold of certainty. A vanished civilization, if it existed, would likely be one of those phenomena. Another uncomfortable realization is that we may already have examples of near-vanishing civilizations within recorded history. Societies we know existed, but about which we know almost nothing. Groups known only by a name in someone else's account. Cultures inferred from a few artifacts with no clear context. If that can happen over a few thousand years, it becomes much more plausible over tens of thousands. There is also the issue of confirmation bias. We tend to see what we expect to see. If we expect early humans to be simple, we interpret ambiguous evidence as simple. If we expect complexity only after certain milestones, we push anything that contradicts that expectation into error categories. This doesn't mean archaeologists are careless. It means they work within frameworks that have proven useful. But frameworks evolve. What was once unthinkable becomes accepted once enough evidence accumulates. The question then becomes not whether a civilization could vanish without a trace, but what level of trace we would require to acknowledge it. A city, a script, a tool tradition, a chemical signature. Each threshold excludes certain possibilities. It's also important to recognize that disappearance does not require total absence. It requires ambiguity. If what remains can be explained in other ways, the civilization remains hypothetical. A worked stone can be a tool or a geofact. A terrace can be agriculture or erosion. A myth can be memory or metaphor. When every trace has an alternative explanation, certainty evaporates. This does not mean all explanations are equally likely. Some are more plausible than others, but plausibility is shaped by expectation. Another aspect often missed is time compression in interpretation. We tend to imagine that if a civilization existed, it must have existed recently enough to leave clear traces. But a civilization that existed 50,000 or 100,000 years ago faces a very different preservation environment. Most of the landscapes we see today did not exist in their current form then. Many have been resurfaced multiple times. Sediment accumulation alone can bury sites beyond reach. Tectonic uplift and subsidence rearrange regions. What was once accessible becomes deeply buried or destroyed. In that context, vanishing without a trace becomes less extraordinary. The Earth has erased entire mountain ranges. It has opened and closed oceans. It has extinguished most species that ever lived. The idea that it could erase the traces of a few human societies is not radical. It is consistent with everything we know about geological time. What feels radical is the implication that our story might not be the first draft, that humanity's relationship with civilization might be older and more experimental than we assume. This implication is uncomfortable not because it diminishes us, but because it removes certainty. It suggests that progress is fragile, that memory is vulnerable, that what we build today is not guaranteed to endure. There is also a quieter implication. If civilizations can vanish without a trace, then the absence of evidence should not be used as a blunt instrument to dismiss questions. It should be treated as a starting point for humility. Humility does not mean believing everything. It means recognizing limits. At this point, it's worth noticing how the question has shifted. We started by asking whether a civilization could vanish without a trace. What we're really asking now is whether our methods are capable of detecting everything that ever mattered. The answer to that is clearly no. Science is powerful, but it is constrained by preservation, access, and interpretation. It reconstructs the past from what remains, not from what once was in full. That gap between remains and reality is where uncertainty lives. Science is often described as a body of knowledge, but it is more accurately a process, a way of asking questions, testing ideas, and gradually narrowing uncertainty. What gets less attention is that science also contains silence. Not intentional silence, not secrecy, but gaps where data is missing, questions remain unresolved, or conclusions cannot yet be drawn. These silences are not failures. They are structural features of how science works, and when it comes to deep human history, they matter more than we often admit. Silence in science does not mean ignorance, it means restraint. It means there is not enough reliable evidence to speak with confidence. In everyday research, this is normal. Most hypotheses never become conclusions. Most data points raise more questions than they answer. But outside of scientific circles, silence is often misinterpreted. It is taken to mean that nothing is there, rather than that something cannot yet be said. This misunderstanding becomes especially important when discussing early human history and the possibility of civilizations far older than we currently recognize. The absence of clear statements is often read as rejection. If science does not affirm an idea, it must have disproven it. In reality, many ideas sit in a third category: not accepted, not rejected, simply unconfirmed. This distinction is subtle, but crucial. Scientific knowledge advances through evidence that meets strict standards. Claims must be supported by data that is reproducible, well contextualized, and independently verifiable. When evidence falls short, science does not fill the gap with speculation. It waits. That waiting can last decades or centuries depending on conditions. Deep time magnifies this waiting. Evidence from tens of thousands of years ago is inherently fragmentary. It arrives unevenly. It is shaped by preservation bias, access, and chance. Entire regions remain unexplored. Entire classes of material rarely survive. In that context, silence is not surprising. It is expected. Yet the public narrative often treats silence as resolution. If textbooks do not mention earlier civilizations, then earlier civilizations must not have existed. This leap ignores how conservative scientific consensus is by design. Consensus reflects what is most strongly supported, not what is merely possible. This conservatism is one of science's strengths. It prevents error from spreading unchecked, but it also means that ideas requiring subtle or diffuse evidence face an uphill battle. They are not dismissed outright, but they remain unspoken in authoritative summaries. Archaeology, in particular, is shaped by what can be shown clearly. a site, a layer, a tool, a date. When these align, conclusions can be drawn. When they do not, interpretation becomes cautious. Cautious interpretation often sounds like silence. There are many reasons why evidence might not align cleanly. Dating methods have limits. Radiocarbon dating only works on organic material and only within certain time ranges. Stratigraphy can be disturbed. Context can be ambiguous. Objects can be intrusive. Geological processes can mix layers. When uncertainty accumulates, responsible researchers refrain from strong claims. They publish tentative findings. They outline alternative explanations. They note limitations. Over time, if more evidence emerges, interpretations may firm up. If not, the question remains open. From outside the field, this openness can be mistaken for indecision. In reality, it is intellectual discipline. The problem arises when silence is used rhetorically, when it is taken as proof that no alternative is worth considering. This is where curiosity can be prematurely shut down, not by data, but by assumption. It is important to be precise here. Science does reject many ideas. Claims that contradict well-established evidence without sufficient support are rightly dismissed. But not every unproven idea falls into that category. Some ideas simply lack enough evidence to be evaluated. The question of earlier civilizations is one of these. There is no definitive evidence that proves their existence. There is also no definitive evidence that proves they could not have existed. The silence exists because the data is insufficient, not because the case is closed. This kind of silence is uncomfortable because it resists narrative. It does not provide a neat answer. It requires patience and humility. Another aspect of scientific silence is specialization. Modern science is deeply specialized. Researchers focus on narrow questions. An archaeologist studies a specific region and period. A geologist studies specific formations. A geneticist studies specific markers. Each produces detailed knowledge within a limited scope. This specialization is necessary. It allows depth and rigor. But it also means that broad integrative questions can fall between disciplines. Who is responsible for asking whether civilization could have existed earlier under different forms? No single field owns that question. Archaeology looks for artifacts. Geology looks at layers. Anthropology looks at culture. Genetics looks at populations. Each field may find nothing definitive within its domain. Taken together, those absences form a silence. But that silence does not necessarily mean the question is meaningless. It means it is interdisciplinary and therefore harder to address conclusively. Funding also shapes silence. Research requires resources. Sites are excavated not just because they are interesting, but because they are accessible, fundable, and politically feasible. Underwater archaeology, deep subsurface exploration, and remote region surveys are expensive and slow. Many potential lines of inquiry remain unexplored simply because they are impractical. When no one looks, there is no data. When there is no data, there is silence. That silence reflects logistical limits, not historical certainty. There is also the issue of publication bias. Journals favour clear results. Discoveries that fit existing frameworks are easier to publish. Ambiguous findings are harder to place. Null results often go unreported. This skews the visible record toward confirmation rather than uncertainty. An archaeologist who finds nothing unusual rarely publishes that absence. Yet those absences matter. They shape interpretation just as much as discoveries do. The public rarely sees this invisible labour. It sees polished conclusions. Those conclusions are often framed as final, even when researchers know they are provisional. Another source of silence is reputational risk. Proposing ideas that challenge established timelines can carry professional cost if evidence is weak. Researchers may choose caution not because they lack curiosity, but because the standards for extraordinary claims are high. This is not suppression, it is self-regulation. but it does mean that some questions are explored quietly, tentatively, or not at all until stronger evidence appears. Silence can also arise from language. Scientific writing is deliberately restrained. Words like possible, suggests, and may indicate are common. Strong statements are avoided unless evidence is overwhelming. To a general audience, this can sound evasive. In reality, it reflects respect for uncertainty. When popular accounts translate this language, nuance is often lost. Tentative findings become either sensationalized or ignored. The middle ground disappears. This matters because the idea of earlier civilizations lives in that middle ground. It is neither confirmed nor absurd. It is a hypothesis constrained by what we know and limited by what we do not. Science has a long history of revising timelines. Humans appeared earlier than expected. Migration routes were more complex than assumed. Cultural behaviours emerged earlier and independently in multiple regions. Each revision began as a challenge to silence. Before evidence accumulated, there was restraint. Once evidence crossed a threshold, silence gave way to consensus. This pattern suggests that silence is not a verdict. It is a holding state. Another important silence lies in how uncertainty is taught. Education often emphasizes what is known rather than how it is known. Students learn conclusions, not debates. Gaps are minimized to maintain coherence. This is practical, but it creates the impression that knowledge is complete. By the time people encounter unresolved questions, their expectations are already shaped. They assume that what is not taught is not worth asking. In reality, many of the most active areas of research exist at the edges of knowledge, where silence is loudest. Silence also matters because it invites interpretation. When official narratives leave gaps, alternative narratives rush in. Some are thoughtful, some are speculative, some are misleading. The absence of clear communication about uncertainty creates space for extremes. This is why it is important to distinguish between silence and denial. When science says, "we don't know," it should be heard as such, not as we know it didn't happen. The question of whether we are Earth's first civilization sits squarely in this space. Science does not say yes. It does not say no. It says that evidence is insufficient to support the claim. That is a very different statement. Understanding this difference changes how we approach the question. It shifts the focus from belief to inquiry, from assertion to exploration. Another silence worth noting is temporal scale. Science is very good at reconstructing relatively recent history. The last few thousand years are richly documented. As we move further back, resolution decreases, dates widen, interpretations loosen, confidence drops. This is not because early humans were less interesting. It is because time erodes evidence. When timelines stretch into the tens of thousands of years, silence becomes the default. Speaking requires extraordinary preservation. Expecting clear answers from such depths is unreasonable. Recognizing that is not pessimism, it is realism. There is also a philosophical silence. Science avoids questions it cannot operationalize. A question must be testable to be addressed scientifically. The idea of a vanished civilization is difficult to test directly. It does not produce a single prediction. It produces many weak ones. This does not mean the idea is meaningless. It means it sits at the boundary of scientific method. Exploring it requires creativity, cross-disciplinary thinking, and patience. Some questions are not answered by finding a single artifact. They are answered by patterns, by accumulation, by elimination of alternatives over time. Science is slow at this. It is not designed for dramatic reversals. It is designed for careful convergence. Silence in this sense is protective. It prevents premature conclusions, but it also requires careful communication so that silence is not mistaken for certainty. Why does all of this matter? Because how we interpret silence shapes how we think about our place in history. If we treat silence as proof of absence, we close off inquiry. We reinforce a narrative of inevitability and uniqueness. We assume that our version of civilization is the first and only serious attempt. If we treat silence as uncertainty, we leave room for humility. We acknowledge that the past may be more complex than our current models suggest. Humility does not undermine science, it strengthens it. It keeps questions alive long enough for better methods to emerge. New tools are already changing what silence looks like. Remote sensing reveals hidden structures. Genetic studies uncover unexpected migrations. Climate science reconstructs environments once thought stable. Each advance reduces some silences and reveals new ones. What was once invisible becomes visible. What was once unaskable becomes discussable. The silences that remain are not empty. They are placeholders for future understanding. What does it mean for us now to live with uncertainty about our deepest past? How does that uncertainty change how we see civilization, progress, and responsibility? Once the question shifts from whether others might have come before us to what they might have been like, the ground becomes less speculative and more constrained than it first appears. Imagination still plays a role, but it is not free to wander anywhere it wants. It has to move within the boundaries set by biology, environment, and everything we already know about how humans live, adapt, and organize themselves. Whatever came before, if anything did, would not have been alien in the dramatic sense. They would have been shaped by the same planet, the same physical limits, and the same basic human needs. The first thing to set aside is the idea that an earlier civilization would have looked like a shadow version of our own, complete with towering skylines, machines humming endlessly, and landscapes carved into rigid grids. That image comes from projecting modern habits backward. It assumes that technological development has only one possible destination, and that destination looks like us. History already shows that this assumption doesn't hold even over short timescales. Different societies emphasize different solutions, even when they have access to similar resources. If others came before us, they would have been constrained by their environments far more directly than we are. Climate would not have been something to manage indirectly through global systems, but something felt immediately in daily life. A shift in rainfall, a cooling trend, or a rise in sea level would have been existential concerns, not abstract data points. That alone would shape priorities. Such societies would likely have been highly attuned to their surroundings, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Survival over long periods requires attention, knowing when animals migrate, when plants fruit, when rivers flood, and when storms arrive. This kind of knowledge accumulates slowly and is passed on carefully. It does not require writing, but it does require continuity and respect for experience. If a civilization existed before ours, it may have placed far more emphasis on ecological stability than expansion. Expansion is costly. It requires surplus, defense, and constant growth. Stability, on the other hand, prioritizes balance, maintaining access to resources without exhausting them, avoiding actions that produce short-term gains but long-term vulnerability. This does not mean such a civilization would have been peaceful or ideal. It means its success would have depended on restraint as much as innovation. That kind of restraint leaves fewer scars on the land. From our perspective, it would look like absence rather than presence. Social organization would not necessarily resemble modern states. Centralized bureaucracy is one solution to coordination, not the only one. Networks of semi-independent groups linked by shared rituals, trade, and knowledge can achieve high levels of organization without dense urban centers. These networks are flexible. They adapt to disruption better than rigid hierarchies, but they also dissolve more easily when links break. A civilization organized this way could persist for long periods without building permanent cities. Gathering places might exist seasonally. Structures might be rebuilt regularly rather than preserved indefinitely. From an archaeological standpoint, this would look like repeated short-term occupation rather than continuous settlement. Technology, too, would likely have followed a different trajectory. Stone might still appear, because stone survives. But much of their technology could have been organic. Woodworking, basketry, textiles, resins, adhesives, leathers. These materials allow for complex tools and structures but rarely survive deep time. Consider how much of modern life would vanish if only stone remained. No wiring, no plastics, no paper, no fabric. Even metals corrode and disperse. What would be left would give a very distorted picture of who we were. The same distortion would apply to any earlier society. If others came before us, their technological sophistication might not register as such in the archaeological record. It might show up as isolated refinements, tools that seem oddly specialized, structures that seem out of place, techniques that appear briefly, then disappear. Their relationship with energy would also matter. Industrial civilization is defined by concentrated energy sources. Fossil fuels allow us to do enormous work quickly. Without them, energy must be gathered and applied more gradually. Muscle power, water, wind, heat. These can support complex societies, but they do not leave the same kinds of waste or infrastructure. A civilization that never crossed into fossil fuel use would leave far fewer lasting traces. No massive mines, no widespread pollution layers, no sharp chemical signatures. Its environmental footprint would blend more easily into natural background variation. Knowledge transmission would likely have been oral and experiential, skills taught through demonstration rather than instruction manuals. Astronomy learned through repeated observation rather than calculation alone. Medicine practiced through accumulated experience rather than formal theory. This kind of knowledge is powerful but fragile. It depends on people being present. When populations decline or disperse, the knowledge collapses quickly. What remains are fragments, practices without explanation, stories without context. Cultural memory would play a central role, not just myth, but practical memory. Which places are safe, which times are dangerous, which behaviours lead to disaster. This memory would be encoded in ritual, taboo, and story. Over time, the practical origins of these rules might be forgotten, but the rules themselves would persist. If a collapse occurred, survivors might retain the rituals but lose the understanding. Later observers would see behaviour without explanation and assume superstition rather than system. It is also likely that any earlier civilization would have been smaller in scale than we imagine. Not because they were less capable, but because scale increases vulnerability. Large, interconnected systems are efficient but brittle. Smaller systems are less efficient but more resilient. A regional civilization spanning river basins or coastlines could achieve significant complexity without ever becoming global. Its rise and fall would barely register outside its region. From a future perspective, it would be a local anomaly rather than a world-changing event. Population size matters here. A civilization does not require millions of people. It requires density in certain nodes and continuity over time. A few tens of thousands of people, if well organized, can maintain complex traditions. If those people disappear or disperse, their civilization ends, regardless of how sophisticated it once was. This reframes what civilization means. Instead of thinking in terms of monuments and empires, it becomes about sustained coordination and shared knowledge. That kind of civilization can exist quietly. There is also the question of conflict. Earlier civilizations would not have been immune to it. Competition over resources, internal disputes, and external pressures would still apply, but the scale and nature of conflict might differ. Without standing armies or mass production, conflict would be more localized and less destructive to the environment. This again reduces long-term traces. Wars that leave no scorched earth or massive fortifications leave little behind archaeologically, yet they can still reshape societies profoundly. If others came before us, their collapse would likely not have been a single event. More likely, it would have been a drawn-out process. Climate stress leading to migration, migration leading to fragmentation, fragmentation leading to loss of shared knowledge. Over time, the civilization dissolves into smaller groups, each carrying partial memory. From the inside, this would not feel like the end of a civilization. It would feel like adaptation, people responding to immediate needs, unaware that something larger is slipping away. This gradual process is particularly effective at erasing evidence. There is no destruction layer, no final moment to point to, just thinning traces until nothing coherent remains. Another important point is that earlier civilizations would not have known they were early. They would not have thought of themselves as precursors. They would have lived in the present, solving present problems just as we do. The idea that they might be forgotten would not have shaped their behaviour, unless forgetting had already happened before. If they did inherit knowledge from an even earlier culture, their myths might reflect that. Stories of ancestors who knew more, places that were once important, skills that were lost. This layering of memory could stretch back far beyond what archaeology can currently detect. There is also the possibility that earlier civilizations experimented with paths we did not take. Social structures that prioritized cooperation over hierarchy. Technologies that emphasized biological processes rather than mechanical ones. Relationships with the environment that minimized extraction. Such paths might not scale the way ours did, but they might persist longer under stable conditions. They would not produce the same explosive growth, but they might avoid some of the vulnerabilities that come with it. From our perspective, success is often defined by expansion and dominance. From a long-term perspective, success might be defined by endurance. A civilization that lasted 20,000 years without leaving massive scars might be more successful, by some measures, than one that burns brightly for a few centuries and collapses. This raises an uncomfortable mirror. When we ask what earlier civilizations might have been like, we're also implicitly asking what aspects of our own civilization are contingent rather than inevitable. What choices we've made because of circumstances, not destiny. If others came before us and vanished quietly, it suggests that civilization is not a guaranteed upward path. It is an experiment repeated under different conditions. Some experiments last longer, some fail quickly. All are constrained by the planet they inhabit. It also suggests that intelligence and complexity are not rare flukes, but natural outcomes when conditions allow. If that is true, then the question is not why civilization appeared, but why it sometimes disappears. Earlier civilizations, if they existed, would have faced the same fundamental challenges: resource management, social cohesion, environmental change, internal inequality, external shocks. The details differ, but the pressures remain. They may have solved some of these challenges better than we have, or worse, or simply differently. One of the most sobering possibilities is that earlier civilizations may have understood impermanence more clearly than we do. Living closer to environmental limits, experiencing collapse firsthand, they may have internalized the idea that no system lasts forever. Their cultures may have emphasized renewal rather than accumulation. If so, their lack of monumental remains would not be an accident. It would be a reflection of values. This is difficult to reconcile with modern expectations. We equate lasting structures with importance. We assume that what matters must endure physically. But meaning does not require permanence. It requires relevance. A civilization can matter deeply to its members and leave almost nothing behind for us. This realization shifts the tone of the question. Instead of asking why we don't see clear evidence of earlier civilizations, we might ask why we expect to. Our expectations are shaped by our own behaviors, not universal rules. When we strip away the assumptions, the idea of earlier civilizations becomes less sensational and more mundane. Not lost golden ages or advanced empires, but societies that rose, adapted, and eventually dissolved into the background of human history. That does not make them unimportant. It makes them human. As this perspective settles, the question becomes less about proving that others came before us and more about understanding what their existence would imply, about fragility, about memory, about the difference between progress and endurance. If civilization is fragile, if forgetting is easy, and if we may not be the first to walk this path, then what does that mean for us, standing here now, surrounded by our own assumptions of permanence? Standing here now, with all of this quietly laid out behind us, the question shifts in a subtle but important way. It stops being about the past as something distant and becomes about the present as something fragile. Not fragile in a dramatic sense, not balanced on the edge of immediate collapse, but fragile in the longer, slower way that only becomes obvious when you widen the frame far enough. If we allow for the possibility that others may have come before us, even without certainty, it changes how we interpret our own moment. It introduces humility where confidence often sits. It suggests that what we are living through is not the inevitable peak of a long ascent, but one expression of a recurring human pattern. That doesn't make our achievements meaningless. It makes them conditional. One of the most immediate implications is how we think about permanence. Modern civilization is built on the assumption that continuity is normal. We plan decades ahead. We assume institutions will persist. We store information with the expectation that it will be accessible indefinitely. We speak about progress as though it naturally accumulates, but nothing in deep history supports permanence as a default. Continuity has always been something that must be actively maintained, and even then, it remains vulnerable to forces outside human control, climate shifts, geological change, resource limits, social fragmentation. These are not hypothetical risks, they are constants. If earlier civilizations rose and fell quietly, leaving behind only ambiguous traces, then what we call advancement may be less about reaching a final state, and more about navigating a temporary window of stability, a window that opens under certain conditions and closes under others. This perspective reframes progress. Instead of a straight line upward, progress becomes something closer to balance, a dynamic relationship between capability and restraint, growth and maintenance, innovation and memory. When that balance tips too far in one direction, systems become brittle. Brittleness is rarely obvious from the inside. Systems often appear strongest just before they fail. Infrastructure expands, complexity increases, dependencies multiply. Everything works until it doesn't. When failure comes, it often cascades faster than expected. Looking at our own world through this lens can be uncomfortable. We are more interconnected than any civilization before us. Our systems span the planet. Our supply chains cross continents. Our knowledge is stored digitally, dependent on constant energy input and technical upkeep. This interconnectedness brings enormous power, but it also concentrates risk. If something disrupts the systems that support information storage, communication, and energy distribution, the effects would be immediate. And while some knowledge would survive, much of it would not. Not because it lacks value, but because it lacks redundancy outside the systems that maintain it. Redundancy is one of the quiet lessons embedded in deep history. Cultures that survive disruption tend to encode knowledge in multiple forms. Practical skills pass through hands-on teaching. Stories that preserve lessons even when details fade. Tools that can be recreated with local materials. Systems that degrade gracefully rather than collapsing entirely. Modern civilization excels at efficiency. It is less comfortable with redundancy. We optimize systems for performance, often at the expense of resilience. From a short-term perspective, this makes sense. From a deep-time perspective, it is a vulnerability. If others came before us and vanished quietly, they may not have failed because they lacked intelligence or creativity. They may have failed because conditions changed faster than their systems could adapt, or because the very strategies that made them successful under one set of conditions made them fragile under another. This realization shifts responsibility. It suggests that intelligence alone is not enough. Knowledge alone is not enough. Survival over long spans of time requires alignment with forces larger than any one society. Another implication is how we value knowledge. We often treat knowledge as something abstract, detached from context. Facts stored in databases, theories written in journals. But knowledge that survives collapse tends to be embodied. It lives in practices, habits, and skills. Knowing how to do something matters more than knowing that something is true. If the archaeological record teaches us anything, it's that written and digital knowledge is more fragile than we like to admit. Without continuous copying and interpretation, it disappears. What remains is what people carry with them in their bodies and routines. This doesn't mean we should abandon complex knowledge systems. It means we should recognize their dependence on stability, and perhaps ask whether some forms of knowledge deserve to be preserved in ways that do not rely entirely on fragile infrastructure. Another quiet shift happens in how we view uniqueness. Modern narratives often emphasize that our time is unprecedented. In some ways, that is true. The scale and speed of our impact on the planet is unlike anything before. But unprecedented does not mean exempt. If civilization has arisen before, even in different forms, then intelligence and organization are not miracles. They are responses. They emerge when conditions allow. They fade when conditions change. Our moment is special not because it breaks that pattern, but because it participates in it. This can be grounding rather than diminishing. It places us within a longer human story rather than above it. It suggests continuity of effort rather than destiny. It also reframes the idea of legacy. We often think about legacy in terms of what we leave behind physically, buildings, infrastructure, records. But deep time shows that physical legacy is unreliable. What endures longest are impacts on systems, ecological changes, genetic legacies, cultural patterns that propagate forward in altered forms. If earlier civilizations existed and left little trace, their true legacy may not be ruins, it may be influence, practices absorbed and transformed by later groups, stories that survive without attribution, behaviors that feel instinctive but have deep roots. This possibility complicates the idea of originality. Some of what we consider uniquely modern may be rediscovery rather than invention, not in a direct sense, but in the sense that human problem-solving converges on similar solutions under similar pressures. Agriculture emerges repeatedly, urbanization emerges repeatedly, trade networks emerge repeatedly, so do collapses. Recognizing this repetition does not make history cyclical in a simplistic way. It makes it conditional. Outcomes depend on choices, but choices are constrained by environment and circumstance. This perspective can influence how we think about the future. If civilization is an experiment rather than an endpoint, then the question becomes not how far we can push systems, but how long we can keep them adaptable. Adaptability shows up again and again in the deep past as a survival trait. Societies that can change course without losing coherence fare better than those that commit fully to a single path. Flexibility matters more than optimization when conditions are uncertain. Our current moment is defined by rapid change, climate systems shifting, ecosystems under stress, technological acceleration outpacing social adaptation. In this context, the idea that others may have walked similar paths before us becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes a mirror. If others came before us and did not endure, the reasons likely weren't mysterious. They would have been ordinary: overextension, resource strain, inflexibility, unanticipated feedback loops. These are not exotic failures, they are common ones. The difference now is scale. Our systems operate globally. Failures propagate faster, but the underlying dynamics remain familiar. There is also a quieter, more personal implication. Thinking in deep time can soften the pressure of the present. If our civilization is not the final chapter, then individual moments matter in different ways. Not as contributions to an eternal monument, but as acts of care within a temporary structure. Meaning does not require permanence. A conversation matters even if it is forgotten. A choice matters even if its consequences are limited. Earlier civilizations, if they existed, matter deeply to the people living within them, regardless of whether we remember them now. That perspective can be strangely calming. It reduces the need to justify existence through lasting impact. It allows value to exist in experience rather than endurance. At the same time, it sharpens ethical responsibility. Knowing that systems can fail, that memory can vanish, and that recovery is not guaranteed makes present choices heavier, not lighter. If we want continuity, we must actively support it. Support does not mean resisting change at all costs. It means designing systems that can change without breaking. It means valuing resilience alongside innovation. It means recognizing that speed and scale are not neutral virtues. Another implication lies in how we teach history. If we present the past as a simple ladder leading inevitably to now, we create unrealistic expectations about the future. We imply that collapse is abnormal and unlikely. Deep time suggests the opposite. Collapse is part of the pattern. The question is not whether disruption will occur, but how societies respond when it does. Teaching uncertainty, gaps, and revision as normal aspects of knowledge prepares people better than teaching certainty alone. It builds intellectual resilience. It reduces shock when assumptions fail. There is also a cultural implication. Modern societies often struggle with the idea of limits. Limits on growth, limits on extraction, limits on control. Deep history is a record of limits being enforced repeatedly, regardless of intention. If earlier civilizations existed and were constrained or erased by these limits, then acknowledging them is not pessimistic. It is realistic. This does not mean adopting fatalism. It means aligning ambition with understanding, building systems that can retreat as well as expand, that can simplify as well as complexify. From this vantage point, the question of being Earth's first civilization becomes less important than it first appeared. Whether we are first or not matters less than whether we are attentive to signals, attentive to fragility, attentive to the difference between growth and endurance. If others came before us, they were not warnings in the sense of moral lessons carved in stone. They were experiments conducted under different conditions. Some succeeded for long periods, some did not. The record we inherit is incomplete, but the pattern is visible enough to learn from. Even if we are the first civilization in the strictest sense, the same lessons apply. Earth does not care about our narratives. It responds to actions. Stability is not promised. Memory is not guaranteed. Standing here now means recognizing that we are both powerful and temporary, capable of extraordinary coordination, and yet dependent on conditions we do not fully control. This recognition can lead in many directions. Toward anxiety, if taken too personally, or toward care if taken collectively, toward competition, or toward cooperation. The deep past does not dictate our response. It only provides context. Perhaps the most important thing it offers is perspective, a reminder that civilization is not a possession but a process, one that must be renewed continually, not assumed. And as this thought settles, there is no need to conclude anything definitively. The question remains open, as it should. Not as a challenge demanding proof, but as a quiet companion to how we think about time, progress, and responsibility. The ground beneath us has carried many stories. Some are clear, some are faint, some may never be recovered. What matters now is not solving every mystery, but noticing how easily certainty dissolves when you look far enough back, and how that dissolution invites a gentler, more careful way of standing here now, within a world that has always been changing.